Number 5. John Hill. Ottumwa is a small city in southern Iowa, and it is home to a disturbing unsolved mystery. Early on the morning of November 22, 1976, two men walked into the Ottumwa laundrette, and in a small room they found the dead body of the 51-year-old owner of the laundrette, John Hill. He had been stabbed multiple times and shot. The police were called to the scene, and they found a .25 caliber handgun on the floor near Hill's body. Near the entrance of the laundrette, the police found 5 bullet holes. The police concluded that Hill died as a result of a robbery gone wrong. Hill fired his gun 5 times at the robber and missed with each shot. The robber attacked Hill, stabbing and shooting him. The police said that it was a long, drawn-out struggle. Then the killer did something really unusual. Despite having multiple gunshots go off, which would have drawn a lot of attention, the killer took the time to write something in the victim's blood at the crime scene. It either said black or lack, and then the second word was older. The police are unsure what the words refer to or their significance. There were 2 suspects in the case who were a couple, but neither were charged because they had strong alibis. Unfortunately, the case has never been solved, and Hill's family is still looking for answers as to who is responsible for his brutal and senseless murder. Number 4. Tracy Nielsen. After a day of classes at medical school on January 5, 1981, Jeff Nielsen returned home to the apartment that he shared with his wife of 5 months, Tracy Nielsen, in Moore, Oklahoma. It was Tracy's birthday. She had turned 21. When Jeff got to the apartment, he found the door unlocked. Inside the apartment, he found Tracy on the bed. She was lying face up. Her throat had been slit, and she had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. During the police investigation, they were quickly able to rule Jeff out as a suspect. What the police learned is that on the morning of her birthday, Tracy ran around and did some errands, and then a neighbor saw Tracy finishing up her chores around the apartment at about noon. During the afternoon, her friends and family had been calling to wish her a happy birthday, but no one answered the phone. The medical examiner placed her time of death at some time around noon. She had not been sexually assaulted. There was no evidence of a break-in, and there was no signs of a struggle inside the apartment. Robbery doesn't appear to be a motive because there was only one item missing from the apartment. It was a 1-inch by 4-inch keychain that Tracy used, which had her name on it. The police think that the killer took it with him as a souvenir. The killer left several clues in the apartment, notably a single fingerprint, but unfortunately no match to it has ever been found. The second clue is a cable ticket book from Southwestern Bell for cable repair, which may explain how the killer got into the apartment without breaking in or forcing his way in, because Tracy may have let him in since he was a repairman. The last ticket in the book lists Tracy's address as the service address. Whoever filled out the ticket said that the work was completed, and then they signed or initialed it at the bottom. The ticket said that the work was finished at 11:51 a.m. on the day of the murder. The police and the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation are hoping that someone will recognize the signature or the handwriting. Since the murder, the police have followed up on 1,500 leads, but after 35 years, they are no closer to figuring out who killed Tracy Nielsen on her 21st birthday. Number 3. Gary Grant Jr. January 12, 1984 was a Thursday, but 7-year-old Gary Grant Jr. of Atlantic City, New Jersey had the day off school because there was a teacher conference. Gary left his house at about 2:30 in the afternoon, and he told his mother that he had an appointment. His mother never thought to ask what he meant by appointment. Gary was supposed to return home by 4 o'clock, and when he didn't, his mother called the police. His neighborhood was searched, and 2 days after he went missing, his body was found 2 blocks from his house in a vacant lot. The 7-year-old had been bludgeoned to death with a metal pipe. The last person seen with Gary was his 12-year-old friend, Carl Mason, whose nickname was Boo. The police interviewed Carl, who has a developmental disability and was smaller than Gary, without a guardian or a lawyer present, and he confessed to the murder. He was arrested and sent to juvenile detention. Once he was incarcerated, Carl said that he was innocent. He was given 2 polygraph tests. One was inconclusive, and the other showed that he was telling the truth about being innocent. The judge eventually threw out the confession, and Carl was released. Not long afterwards, the investigation into Gary's murder frosted over. This was especially tough on Gary Grant Sr., who was a police officer with the Atlantic City Police Department. On January 4th, 1986, a message was found scrawled on the side of an Atlantic City police car. It read, "Gary Grant's dead. I am living. Another will die on January 12th if all goes right." January 12th was the 2nd anniversary of Gary's murder. Luckily, January 12th came and went, and no one was murdered in Atlantic City on that day. A few weeks later, a second message was found. This time it was scratched onto a sidewalk. It said, "Gary Grant Jr. lives. I still killed him. Son of a pig officer. Payback is an MF." The last message led to speculation that Grant may have been killed as payback against his father because he arrested somebody. However, that theory has never been proven. In fact, to this day, the police are uncertain if the killer actually wrote the messages or if they were just a horrible prank. The case has sat cold ever since, but a new clue emerged in 2016. Gary Grant Sr. was converting some audio tapes to MP3 files when he came across one that was labeled phone calls. On the audio tape, he heard the following call that was made to the 911 dispatch on March 8, 1986, weeks after the messages were found.
Police and fire.
Oh, yes. Is it possible for me to collect the reward on my own self for the murder of Gary Grant? No, well, how's if I did it myself and I want to collect the old reward?
If you did it?
Yeah.
Well, suppose I hook you into the Detective Bureau.
No, it's okay.
I mean, that's only you.
Make sure they know that's not a crank call. You're never going to catch them.
This wasn't the only mysterious phone call on the audio tape. A few weeks after the bizarre confession, the 911 dispatch received a second strange phone call regarding the murder of Gary Grant. The caller didn't identify themselves, but they accused a man of killing Gary because his father was a cop. The man's name was never made public because he was never charged. Gary Grant Sr. knows the man, but says that he never had a problem with him. We should also point out that the accused man was arrested in 2011 for sexual contact with a child under the age of 5 and child endangerment. He ended up pleading guilty to child endangerment in 2013. Again, it is unclear if the calls are genuine or just a disturbing prank. Tragically, despite his father conducting his own investigation, the murder of Gary Grant Jr. remains unsolved. Number 2. The Freeway Phantom. The evening of April 25, 1971 was a warm one in Prince George's County, Maryland, and it was just an ordinary Sunday for 13-year-old Carol Spinks and her family. Around dinner time, Carol's older sister asked her to walk to the 7-Eleven, which was about half a mile away from the family's home, to pick up some TV dinners, bread, and soft drinks. Carol made it to the store and purchased her items, but then she disappeared on her way home. Her body was found 6 days later on a grassy embankment next to a highway. A few months later, on the morning of July 8th, 16-year-old Darlena Johnson, who lived a few blocks away from Carol, left her home to go to her summer job at a local recreation center. Sadly, she never made it to work. Her body was found 11 days after she went missing. She had been dumped about 15 feet away from where Carol's body was found. 19 days after Darlena disappeared, 10-year-old Brenda Crockett was sent to the store by her mother. When she didn't return home, her family searched the neighborhood for her. 3 hours after Brenda left for the store, her 7-year-old sister was at home and the phone rang. She answered it, and it was Brenda. She was crying. She said that a white man picked her up and she was heading home in a cab. She also said that she thought she was in Virginia. She then hung up the phone quickly. Minutes later, the phone rang again. Brenda's mother's boyfriend answered it this time. Again, it was Brenda calling. She repeated what she told her sister, and then she added that she was alone in a house with a man. The boyfriend told Brenda to put the man on the phone and to tell him where she was, and he'd come get her. Brenda then asked, "Did my mother see me?" The boyfriend responded, "How could she see you when you're in Virginia? Tell the man to come to the phone." The boyfriend then heard the sound of heavy footsteps, and Brenda said, "I'll see you," and then the line went dead. Hours later, Brenda's body was found along a highway in Prince George's County. Her body wasn't hidden like the first two victims. She had been raped and strangled to death. A scarf was tied around her neck. The police think that the killer made Brenda call her home to give them false information to throw investigators off his track. On October 8th, 12-year-old Nino Moshio Yates went missing while walking home from the store in Prince George's County. Her corpse was found dumped along the side of the road just hours after she went missing. She had been raped and strangled. Then, around 10:25 on November 15th, 18-year-old Brenda Woodward was seen getting off a bus to transfer to another one. Her body was found near an access ramp early the next morning. She had been strangled and stabbed. Her coat was then laid gently over her body. In her coat pocket there was a note that said, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can. Freeway Phantom." A handwriting analysis was performed on the note, and the handwriting experts said that the note was written by Brenda herself, meaning the Phantom dictated the note to her. At this point, the FBI was called in, and they got thousands of tips, but none of the tips led anywhere. Around the same time that the FBI got involved, the killer took a hiatus. But then on September 5th, 1972, he popped back up again. On that day, witnesses saw 17-year-old Diane Williams as she was heading home on the bus after visiting her boyfriend, but she never made it home. She was found strangled to death off the side of the road hours after she was seen exiting the bus. After the murder of Diane Williams, the freeway phantom killings came to an end. Over the course of 2 years, he claimed at least 6 lives. All the girls were between the ages of 10 and 18, and all of them were African American. The FBI continued to work on the case, but then in 1974, they reassigned the agents that were working on the case because manpower was needed to investigate the Watergate scandal, and the freeway phantom killings went cold. In the ensuing years, cold case investigators have continued to look into the string of murders. One conclusion they drew, which is based on the areas where the girls were kidnapped and the locations where their bodies were dumped, that the Phantom's anchor spot is Congress Heights, which is a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., suggesting that he lived or worked in the area during the time of the murders. There have been several attempts to pull testable DNA from evidence left on the victims, but so far they have not been able to. They also found fibers from a green synthetic carpet on 5 of the 6 girls, however, they have not been able to find the carpet that it belongs to. Finally, something that may just be a total coincidence, but 3 of the 6 victims had the middle name Denise. Over the years, the police have had over 100 potential suspects. The strongest suspect is a man named Robert Askins. Before the freeway phantom murders, he had been charged with murder 3 different times, and he was convicted of one of them in 1938 for poisoning a prostitute with cyanide. He was released 20 years later because of a legal technicality. In 1977, Askins was arrested for raping a 24-year-old woman in his house. After the arrest, the police searched his house. In his desk, they found his appellate court opinion, and in one of the footnotes was the word tantamount. However, there's no physical evidence tying Askins to the freeway phantom murders, and he was never charged. Askins ended up being found guilty of raping and kidnapping the 24-year-old woman, and he was sentenced to life in prison in the late 1970s. He died in prison in 2010 at the age of 91 without ever confessing to the freeway phantom murders. The police are hoping that in the future, some new technology will help them crack the case. Number 1. Jean French, Elizabeth Short, Mimi Boomhauer, and Jean Spangler. February 10, 1947 was a Monday, and a construction worker on his way to work happened upon a woman's body in a field off an isolated road in West Los Angeles. The body was identified as 45-year-old Jean French. When she was in her 30s, Jean was a pioneering female aviator, but in 1947 her glory days were long gone. She was estranged from her 4th husband, Frank French, who possibly suffered from PTSD and supposedly was abusive. Jean herself was an alcoholic who liked to go out and party. On the night before her body was found, Jean was having dinner and drinks at a diner with 2 men. During the meal, she got up from the table and made a phone call. From the way she talked on the phone, a waitress at the diner could tell that Jean was drunk. On the phone, Jean said, "Don't bring a bottle, the landlord doesn't allow it." She then yelled over to the 2 men she was dining with not to put any liquor in the car and not to take any liquor. About 2 hours later, Jean was alone and she stopped in at a drive-in diner where she had coffee with the owner. She talked about her troubles and complained about her estranged husband, Frank. At 10:30, Jean was seen at a bar where she told the other patrons that she was going to commit her husband to the neuropsychiatric ward at the Veterans Hospital the following day. Jean then made her way over to her estranged husband's rooming house. She asked him to come out with her and he turned her down. Frank said that she hit him in the head with her purse and left. Next, Jean was seen at another drive-in diner with a man who had a dark complexion and was small to medium in size. People remembered them because the man bragged about leaving a large tip. After the diner, Jean and her friend were seen at a bar. They were there from 1:30 until 2 o'clock when the bar closed. As it closed, the bartender saw Jean arguing with her friend. When the bartender stepped out of the bar, he saw Jean and her friend get into an old beat-up sedan, and they drove off into the night. Then just hours later, Jean's body was found in the field by the construction worker. Jean had been viciously beaten and stomped. She had massive internal bleeding, her heart was punctured, and her neck was broken. On her torso, someone had written UBD, and under it were the letters TEX. The message was written in Jean's lipstick. The police and the media immediately knew what BD stood for. It stood for Black Dahlia. Just 4 weeks before Jean French was beaten to death, 22-year-old Elizabeth Short's body was found in Los Angeles. Short had been cut in half and her intestines had been removed. Her body was drained of blood, her skin was scrubbed, and her lips were slashed from ear to ear, making it look like she had a horrifying smile. Like Jean French, Short had been dumped in a field. Supposedly, Short also had something written on her body in lipstick. It was 2 small swear words. 8 days after Short's body was found, the story dropped from the front page, and an editor at the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner got a call from someone claiming to be the Black Dahlia Avenger. The caller told the editor that it seemed like they were running out of material on the Black Dahlia murder, so he would send them some of Short's personal belongings, like her birth certificate and her address book. Sure enough, a package arrived at the newspaper 2 days later, which contained several personal items that belonged to Short. A note was also included with the belongings, indicating that a letter would follow. 4 letters were sent in all. All of them were signed off as the Black Dahlia Avenger, but the police are unsure if the letters were from the killer or from someone who knew Short well enough or who had access to her apartment, like a landlord. The police were hesitant to say that the killings of Short and Jean French were connected. The victims did share similar physical features, but the methods of the murders were very different from one another. The newspapers, on the other hand, thought that one person was responsible for both murders. Instead of focusing on the serial killer theory when investigating Jean French's murder, the police immediately looked at the most likely culprit in any murder, the romantic partner of the victim. After all, Frank did seem like a plausible suspect. The couple did have a volatile relationship, and Frank did see her on the night that she died. Frank swore that he had nothing to do with the murder, and he took a lie detector test to prove it. He ultimately passed the polygraph test. The police interviewed Jean's son, and he said that Frank had tolerated a lot from his mother and that she was more than capable of getting herself into trouble. After that, Frank was dropped as a suspect. However, without Frank, the police were out of suspects, and nothing happened with the case for 2 years. But then 2 years later, there was another odd case that happened in Los Angeles that may or may not be related to the murders of Jean French and Elizabeth Short. On August 18, 1949, a friend talked to 48-year-old Mimi Boomhauer over the phone sometime between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock p.m. The call was upbeat and the women talked about an upcoming social event. However, that day was the 6th anniversary of Boomhauer's husband's death. Later that night, the police were summoned to her upscale house. The front door was open, her lights were on, and her car was in her garage. Inside the house, there was a salad on the table that Boomhauer didn't eat, there was fresh food in the kitchen, and a dress that had recently been worn was lying on the bed. The house showed no signs of a struggle, and nothing was out of place. However, the 48-year-old widow was nowhere to be found. The immediate conclusion was that Boomhauer, who was having financial problems, committed suicide. In fact, on the night that she disappeared, she was supposed to meet an unidentified man at her house. She was hoping that the man would be interested in purchasing the house. Boomhauer's friends and family said that she seemed happy with her life and was looking forward to upcoming social events, so they thought it was unlikely that she would have killed herself. 5 days after she went missing, her purse was found in a telephone booth in a supermarket in Los Angeles. Nothing appeared to be missing from her purse, but written on its side in big letters was, "Police Department, found this on the beach on Thursday." Thursday was the night that Boomhauer disappeared. The purse didn't show any traces of seawater or sand. Weeks after Boomhauer disappeared from her house, another woman in Los Angeles disappeared. 26-year-old Jean Spangler was an actress that had bit parts in movies, and she had recently acquired a powerful agent. On October 7, 1949, she walked out of her front door to go to the farmer's market, and she never returned home. 2 days later, her purse was found at the entrance to a nearby park. One strap had been ripped, and inside the purse was a note that read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." The police looked into her disappearance and discovered that Spangler was 3 months pregnant, leading to speculation that Dr. Scott was an abortionist. However, they were never able to find out the true identity of Dr. Scott. The police were also unsure who Kirk was, and then they received a rather unusual phone call from movie star Kirk Douglas. He was on vacation and called specifically to tell the police that he wasn't the Kirk in the letter. Police thought that this was suspicious because they never considered him to be the Kirk in the letter. Because of the bizarre call, the police considered Douglas a suspect, and then they discovered that Spangler had recently acted in a movie that had yet to be released, which starred Kirk Douglas. However, Kirk Douglas was eventually cleared in the disappearance. The bodies of Mimi Boomhauer and Jean Spangler have never been found. Newspapers at the time thought that the murders and the disappearances were all connected, but the LAPD weren't convinced. Unfortunately, the LAPD never brought anyone to justice for any of the crimes. However, there is at least one former LAPD homicide detective who thinks that the crimes are all connected, but he didn't join the force until decades after the murders and disappearances. Steve Hodel, who is now retired from the LAPD, believes that his father, who was an unusual and sadistic doctor named George Hill Hodel, is responsible for the 4 crimes plus 5 other murders. George Hodel was on the police's radar, and he was a suspect in the Elizabeth Short murder because of an incident that happened in 1945. His secretary died of a drug overdose, but the police thought that Dr. Hodel had killed her to cover up some financial fraud. The police weren't able to prove anything conclusively, and Dr. Hodel was never charged. After his father died in 1999, Steve Hodel wrote several books on the Black Dahlia murder, arguing that his father is the real killer. For his investigation, he had the handwriting on Boomhauer's purse compared to his father's handwriting, and the examiner said that it was highly probable that it was the same handwriting. The theory of George Hodel being the murderer of Short and the other women is still controversial. It is even unclear if one person is responsible for all the murders and the disappearances. Unfortunately, there's a good chance that these cases may never be solved. Number 5. Gunther Stahl. In 1984, Gunther Stahl was 34 years old and he was living in Anhausen, Germany. He had worked as a food engineer, but in the fall of that year, he was unemployed. He was also suffering from paranoia. He was convinced that he was being followed by people who wanted to hurt him. When his wife asked him who was following him, he only described his stalkers in vague generalities like them and they. On the night of October 25th, 1984, Stahl was at home with his wife. At dinner, he talked about his mysterious stalkers, and then he sat down to watch some television. While he watched TV, he appeared to be deep in thought. Suddenly, he said something to the effect of, "Now I've got it." He grabbed a pen and a piece of paper and either wrote down YOGTZE or Y06TZE. After writing it down, he crossed it out and then he went and put his jacket on. He told his wife that he is going out for a drink. He got into his Volkswagen Golf and drove to a bar in the nearby town of Wilsendorf. When he got to the bar, it was about 11 p.m. and he ordered a beer. Before Stahl could take a sip of his drink, he collapsed on the floor and injured his face. The other patrons of the bar got him to his feet and asked him if he was too drunk. He said that he was sober and he decided to leave the bar. He drove off in his car and no one is sure what he did over the next 2 hours. Around 1 a.m., Stahl was in his hometown of Seelbach, which is about 6 miles away from the bar. He knocked on the door of one of his parents' neighbors. The woman who lived there was in her 70s. She lived alone and she was very religious. Since it was late, she wasn't exactly happy to see him and she didn't let him into her house. Out on the street, Stahl started ranting and he warned the woman that a horrible incident was going to happen that night. The elderly woman told him to go home and she went back to bed. Stahl didn't go home and what he did over the next 2 hours is a mystery. At 3 a.m., 2 truck drivers saw Stahl's VW1 Golf in a trench beside the Autobahn A45 about 60 miles away from his home. When they pulled up, an injured man in a white jacket ran away from the car. Inside the car, they found Stahl. He was sitting in the passenger seat, naked, and covered in blood and leaves. He was severely injured. His left arm was nearly torn off. One driver went to call for help, and the other one stayed with Stahl and asked him what happened. Stahl said that there were 4 of them, and he didn't know who they were. He survived the trip to the hospital, but he died a short time later. The autopsy showed that Stahl wasn't drunk or on drugs when he died. He also didn't die from the injuries he sustained during the car accident. Instead, he was run down by another car in a completely different location from where his car was found crashed in the trench. That means that someone hit Stahl with their car, and then they loaded him into his own car and drove his car until they crashed into the trench. When Stahl was hit by the car, he wasn't wearing any of his clothes. His shoes were in his car, but the rest of his clothes have never been found. The police interviewed Stahl's wife, and she told them about the note, but she said that she threw it away that night, and it has never been found. There are plenty of theories about what YOGTZE means. One theory is that if the G was actually a 6, then Stahl wrote down the call sign of a radio station in Romania. But how this would relate to the case is unknown. There is even the very far-out theory that Stahl somehow foresaw his own death, and what he wrote down was the license plate of the car that hit him. Unfortunately, the true meaning of the note and whether it's related to Stahl's death is still a mystery. The police and Stahl's family are hoping that one day the person or people who are responsible for his death will come forward. Number 4. Randy Parscale. April 7th, 1979 was a Saturday, and 10-year-old Randy Parscale was hiking with his grandfather, his uncle, and his stepbrother in Pepper Sauce Canyon near Oracle, Arizona. At one point, Randy ran ahead of everyone else, and he was far enough away that he was out of their sights. His relatives followed behind, but when they didn't catch up to him, they realized that he was missing. The canyon was searched, but it didn't turn up any traces of Randy. The most probable answer as to what happened to him was that he fell into one of the old mine shafts that are in the canyon. The family, on the other hand, doesn't think that Randy died in the canyon. Instead, they think that several clues indicate that he was kidnapped and he lived to be at least 20 years old. First, a tracker followed Randy's footprints in the canyon, and he said that they came to an end when Randy got into a vehicle. Then, 6 years after he went missing, a woman living in West Virginia called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She said on July 4th, 1985, she was given a $1 bill as part of her change, and on the bill it said, "I'm alive in Phoenix, Arizona. Help me, Randy Parscale." The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children contacted the police, and they looked into it, but it didn't lead anywhere. Then in 1989, the family learned that someone had used Randy's social security number while working at a construction site in Phoenix. His father went to the construction site, but the man who used the social security number was no longer working there. The employees at the site described the man, and his father thought that their description sounded like Randy, who would have been 20 at the time. That was the last time the social security number was used, and it was the last possible trace of Randy. On the screen now is a picture of what Randy might have looked like at the age of 43. If he is still alive today, Randy Parscale would be 48 years old. Number 3. Rachel Runyon. On August 26, 1982, Elaine Runyon Simmons was making sloppy joes for lunch for her children. 5-year-old Justin and 3-year-old Rachel were outside playing with a 10-year-old boy at a park that was 15 feet from the family's backyard fence. The park can be seen in the background of their family photos, which were taken in the backyard. As they were playing, a man approached them. He was described as an African American man between the ages of 25 and 30. He was 6 feet tall with a medium build, and he had a mustache. He talked to the children for about 15 minutes, and then he asked them if they would like to go for some bubble gum and ice cream. Rachel agreed, and she started to walk away with the man. When her brother realized that a stranger was leading her away, he yelled for her to come back. She turned to walk back, and that's when the man grabbed her and ran to a blue car with wood paneling. The two boys ran to the Runyon's house, screaming that someone had grabbed Rachel. The police responded as quickly as they could for 1982, but by the time they got to the park, Rachel and her kidnapper were gone. Sadly, her naked body, with her hands tied behind her back, was found 24 days later, less than 20 miles away from where she was kidnapped. The murder shocked the small city of Sunset, but no one was arrested in the aftermath of the brutal crime. And then strange things started to happen. First, on 2 separate occasions, Rachel's father found a black rose at her gravesite. Next, about 2.5 years after Rachel was kidnapped, the police were called to a 24-hour laundromat. On a stall door in the washroom, in marker, someone wrote, "Beware. I'm still at large. I killed the little Runyon girl. Remember, beware." Then below the message there was an inverted cross, and then there was 3 sixes, one at the head of the cross and the other 2 at the arms of the cross. The police are unsure if the killer left the roses or wrote the message, but a psychologist who worked on the case said it was possible. Some people believe that the black roses and the inverted cross surrounded by 666 indicate that the murder was occult in nature. The police have had about 100 suspects in the murder, but they have yet to charge anyone. In the years since her daughter's death, Rachel's mother has been an advocate for kidnapped and missing children. In August 2016, the park where Rachel was kidnapped was renamed the Rachel Runyon Memorial Park. Number 2. Beth Doe. On December 20th, 1976, a 14-year-old boy made a horrifying discovery while playing under the bridge that crosses over the Lehigh River near Whitehaven, Pennsylvania. It was a severed head that belonged to a woman. Her nose and her ears were missing. The police came to the scene a short time later, and they found the rest of the body. Someone had dismembered the woman and put her body into 3 different suitcases. Tragically, the young woman was full-term pregnant with a girl. The suitcases were thrown from the bridge 300 feet above, which is part of Interstate 80, and the killer was probably hoping that the suitcases would land in the water. Instead, they landed beside the water, which caused 2 of the suitcases to break open. Unfortunately, the police haven't been able to identify her. The medical examiner determined that the woman was probably in her late teens or her early 20s. He also concluded that she died a horrible death. She had been strangled and shot in the throat. The killer then used a fine serrated knife to cut off her nose, her ears, and her breasts, and they have never been found. He used the same knife to dismember the body. The medical examiner said that she was killed 7 to 24 hours before her body was found. 2 of the suitcases that held the body parts were blue, with single red, white, and blue stripes, and the third one was green plaid trim with brown. After they were zipped up, the killer spray painted the suitcases with black paint. Also in the suitcase was a pink chenille bedspread with an embroidered yellow and green flower pattern. One final clue was something that was written on the palm of her left hand. It was probably written on her hand 8 to 12 hours before she was found. It was written in ink and it said WSR, and then below that it was either the number 4 or 5, and then below that and to the right it was either a 4 or a 7. The police thought that it might be a license plate or a CB call sign, but when they looked into it, it didn't lead anywhere, and the police do not know the significance of the writing. Since the woman couldn't be identified, she and her unborn child were buried under the name Beth Doe. In October 2007, her body was exhumed, and bone and tissue samples were taken for further testing. The test indicated that she was probably born in Central or Western Europe, but she came to the United States 5 to 10 years before she was killed. They also determined that she probably didn't live in eastern Pennsylvania, which is where her body was found. Instead, she probably lived in the southeast, quite possibly Tennessee. So while the police have a lot of information regarding the woman, what they don't know is her identity. They also have no clue who killed her. After 4 decades of so many unanswered questions, the case has become hopelessly cold. Number 1. John Zara. The Zara family moved from Milwaukee to Franklin, Wisconsin in March 1975. 9 months later, 14-year-old John Zara was still having problems fitting in at school, and he was missing his old friends. Then, on February 20th, 1976, John didn't come home from school. Fearing that he had been hit by a car or had some other accident on his way home, his father and brother drove to the school where they met the principal. The principal led them to John's locker, and inside was his school books and his winter coat. The police were called and they, along with the fire department, searched the area around the school, but they couldn't find John. They traced John's last steps, and they knew that he was in the cafeteria at lunch. After lunch, he went to study hall. He got a hall pass and left study hall, but after that, no one is sure what happened to him. One witness said that John was wandering around the school lobby and near the drafting room. Another witness said that they saw him walking towards a green Ford Torino in the parking lot. This may explain how John left the school, because he wasn't anywhere near the school grounds. John was found 8 days later in a thicket in Whitnell Park, which is about 6 miles away from the high school. He was naked, laying face down, and his head was on a log. The medical examiner said that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. She said that John had been hit 3 times in the head with a rock that was found at the scene. The medical examiner also found semen inside John's body. And then there was one last possible clue. On John's right wrist, written in ballpoint ink, was the word hell. The murder shocked the small community of Franklin, and the citizens were hoping for a quick arrest. Unfortunately, the investigation quickly ran into trouble. First, the lead detective developed tunnel vision for a suspect, who was a contractor that was working on an addition to the school. When he was interviewed, he swore that he didn't kill John, and he said that he didn't even know him. When they asked him where he was on the day of the murder, he was confused and couldn't remember. He had a bill for a doctor's appointment for 3 o'clock that day, but he couldn't remember where he was earlier in the day. He volunteered to take a polygraph test, and it showed that he was being truthful. He remained a suspect for 2 years, and the case didn't make any progress. This frustrated the Zara family, so they hired a lawyer to look into the case. The lawyer found out that the detective had been carrying on an affair with a woman who was friends with the contractor. He used the investigation as a pretense to see the woman. The detective was eventually suspended for 2 months without pay, and the case went cold. The case found new life 33 years later when someone called the West Allis, West Milwaukee Recreation Department and told them that one of their swimming coaches, Daniel Acker, was a pedophile who abused him in the 1970s. This call came just 2 weeks after a parent complained that Acker had showered with the children after a swimming lesson. Acker was reported to the police, and he agreed to talk with them. Acker had been interviewed about John's murder back in 1976 because someone had reported his attraction to teenage boys. He said that he didn't kill John, so he was given a polygraph test. The results indicated that he was being truthful, so he was dropped as a suspect. When the police interviewed him in 2009, he agreed to let them look around his home. Everything seemed normal until they went into the basement. That's where they found a collection of toy cars and miniature models of a fire station and a police station. They lifted off the roof of the police station, and on the walls of the model were pictures of missing and murdered children. Over each picture was a small LED light. Next, one of the officers picked up a matchbox car and found some names and numbers written on the bottom of it. First was the number 13 and the name Carl Galbraith. Carl Galbraith was a 13-year-old boy who was found murdered in a ditch on December 17, 1977 in New Munster, Wisconsin, which is about 30 miles away from where John went missing. Carl had been stabbed multiple times and his throat was slit. His killer has never been caught. The second number and name was 14 and John C. Zara. The detectives continued to look around the basement and they made some more disturbing discoveries. There was a photo album full of pictures of John and his brothers. They also found maps of John's school in Whitnell Park, which is where he was killed. What was most damning, though, was several handwritten notebooks written entirely about John. The entry dated February 20th, 1976, which was the date of John's murder, reads as follows. John C. Zara was caught, knocked down on the ground, possibly unconscious, and then struck on the right forehead with a round rock, which sadly caused the boy's death. The diary entries continued on for 3 decades. Acker explained that he wasn't the killer. Instead, he was an amateur detective racked by guilt. On the day that John was killed, Acker said that he planned to ride his bike in Whitnell Park, but he didn't because it was raining. When he heard that John was missing, he led a search team in Whitnell Park, but they didn't find the body. He also explained why he wrote the names of murdered children on the bottom of his toy cars and put up pictures of them in his models. He said it was a way to dedicate his hobbies to children who could no longer have hobbies. Besides being a swim coach, Acker also worked at the Milwaukee County Mental Health Complex. In April 1976, a female patient at the complex took a walk with another patient named Joe, but she didn't return. She was found a short time later. Joe had attacked her, and she was barely alive. Luckily, the woman ultimately survived the attack. When they found the woman, there was a stick in her mouth, and her head was resting on a rock. Acker asked Joe why he did that, and he said, "Because that's what I saw them do to the boy in the park." Acker then became convinced that Joe witnessed John's murder. Acker tried to convince the police that Joe saw the murder, but they didn't believe him, so he started his own crusade. He wrote a letter to the Zara family and told them about Joe. He even volunteered to investigate further. John's mother wrote back to him, and their correspondence led to a friendship. Acker investigated John's murder for 3 years, and then he went to the local television news station with his findings. He said that Joe told him that 3 men in a dark car kidnapped John and one of them had a gun. At the park, they took turns assaulting him, and then he was pistol whipped twice before he was hit with a rock. After the news report, Joe's doctor contacted the media and told them that Joe had the intelligence of an 8-year-old. He constantly lied, and he was very impressionable, so he was easy to manipulate. The police showed Joe a photo lineup, and he couldn't pick out John. When he was shown a picture of John, he said that he never saw him before. Something else to point out is that the medical examiner said that John was killed by a rock. She came to that conclusion because of a police report that said that there was a rock with blood and hair on it found near the body. When a cold case investigator got the rock out of evidence, there was no blood or hair on it. This means that someone grabbed the wrong rock, or washed the blood and hair off the rock, or the rock wasn't the murder weapon at all. The medical examiner, Elaine Samuels, was also well known for her carelessness and her recklessness. Around the time of John's murder, she botched 2 sexual assault cases and 1 murder case because she destroyed evidence. She also left dozens of reports uncompleted. Samuels also collected dozens of human testicles without the permission of the deceased, the families, or the county. She kept them in jars in her condo and said that they were part of some research she was doing. John's autopsy was a prime example of her carelessness. For example, she didn't take samples from under John's fingernails, and she didn't know what she did with the contents of his stomach. Not long after John's murder, Samuels failed the certification test to be a medical examiner. Even though she failed her certification, she didn't end up losing her job. In the crime scene photos, near the body, there was also a large, newly broken branch, and it was not taken into evidence. This only added doubt to the minds of the cold case investigators as to what the actual murder weapon was. In turn, this adds doubt to Acker's guilt, because in all of Acker's journals, which could have been written at any time, he only talks about John being killed with the rock. Also, the information in the journals could have come from Acker reading and watching the news. Acker was ultimately convicted on child molestation charges in 2009, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Another suspect was a teacher and hall monitor named Michael Uporski. Uporski had a long criminal history, dating back to when he was just 12 years old. He attacked several boys and young men, held them down, and tickled their feet. Since John's socks were tucked into his shoes, the police thought it was possible that someone with a foot fetish killed him. By the time the police considered Uporski a suspect, it was 1979, and he was working as a scout for the NBA team, the Seattle Supersonics. He flew to Wisconsin, and he took 2 polygraph tests. On the first one, the tester thought that he was being purposely deceptive by gulping breaths to disrupt the machine. On the second test, the tester thought that he was being dishonest. They wanted him to take a third test, but Uporski refused and flew back to Seattle. Uporski was never charged because the police didn't have any evidence tying him to John's murder. In 1979, after they won the NBA championship, the Supersonics fired Uporski because of his connection to the case. Any time that he got a new job, the police would call his new employer and tell them that he was a suspect in the murder of a 14-year-old boy. Obviously, he ended up losing a lot of jobs because of the calls. In 2012, the investigator that was working on the case retired, and in 2015, a new detective was put on the case. He started from the beginning, and he looked through 6,000 pages of reports. He didn't think that the contractor or Uporski were viable suspects, and other detectives wasted too much time investigating them. The suspect that he couldn't eliminate was Acker, but he thought that Acker's obsession with the case could be explained because he grew close to the Zara family after the murder. He also discovered a new suspect. His discovery stemmed from a crime that happened in August 1967, which was 9 years before John was killed. A 14-year-old boy was walking home from football practice in Macwin, Wisconsin, which is about 25 miles away from Franklin, when a man driving a laundry truck offered him a ride. The boy agreed, and the man drove him to a wooded area, and then he had him get out of the truck. He then asked the boy if he wanted to see a rope trick, and he said yes. The man tied up his hands and told him to try to escape. The boy tried, but he couldn't free himself. The driver then forced him to lie down, and then he raped him. After he was done, he led the boy back to the truck with his hand still bound and drove him to another wooded area. Again, he raped the boy. He grabbed a large stick, hit the boy several times in the head, and then threw his body in a ravine. Amazingly, the boy survived, and he identified his attacker as James Lee Crummell. Crummell was convicted for the assault, and he was given an open-end sentence. He ended up serving only 5 years. The cold case investigator thought that there were a lot of similarities between that case and John's murder. Both of them were 14-year-old boys, both of them were sexually assaulted in wooded areas, and both of them were struck in the head. What really stood out to the cold case investigator was that Crummell had a tattoo on his right wrist. It was a drawing of a devil, and below it said, "Born to raise hell." The detective thought it was too much of a coincidence that John would also have the word hell written on his right wrist on the day that he died. Crummell was interviewed about John's murder in the 1970s, and he said he didn't do it. He pointed out that he was living in California at the time of the murder. He lived with a housemate, but the housemate was out of town the week of the murder, so no one could confirm his alibi. Besides attacking the 14-year-old boy in 1967, Crummell was charged with 2 other murders and questioned in 2 others. In February 1967, he killed a 9-year-old boy in Arizona, but he wasn't charged until 1982. He was found guilty, but he only served 4 years in prison because a judge ruled that his defense lawyer was ineffective. Then, in 1990, Crummell led the police to the body of 13-year-old James Trotter, who went missing in 1979 from a bus stop in California. Crummell was charged with that murder in 1997, and he was convicted in 2004. He was sentenced to death. Unfortunately, the cold case investigator wasn't able to interview Crummell because he hung himself in 2012 while sitting on death row. Throughout the years, investigators have tried to test the DNA that was left at the scene, but due to the way it was stored, they have not been able to develop a profile. The police are hoping that one day they will be able to conclusively say who killed John Zara. Number 3. Byron Carr. Charlottetown is the capital of Prince Edward Island, which is a province on Canada's east coast. Statistically, Prince Edward Island is the safest province in Canada, and murders rarely happen there. In recent history, there is only one unsolved confirmed homicide. It happened sometime after 3:10 on the morning of November 11, 1988. Byron Carr was a 36-year-old gay man who worked as a school teacher. He was popular among the students and the staff. On the morning of November 12, 1980, the police were called to his home because he was dead in his bedroom. There were no signs of a break-in, and nothing had been ransacked. The police think that Carr invited his killer into his house after 3:10 a.m. on November 11th, and they had sex before he was killed. He had been strangled to death with a towel, and there was no attempt made to revive him. He was also stabbed once, hours after he was dead. Written on the wall in the bedroom in ballpoint pen was the message, "I will kill again." The police interviewed Carr's neighbors, and a couple of them said that on the night of November 11th, 2 men were acting suspiciously outside the house. This was after he was killed, but before his body was found. The police tried to identify the 2 men, but they didn't have any success. It wasn't long before the case went cold. Then in 2007, the police started to review the case. After they did, 2 witnesses came forward. One approached them in 2008, and another approached them in 2012. The witnesses did not know each other, but they shared very similar stories with the police. They said that a man they knew had confessed to them that he was an accessory after the fact in Carr's murder. They both said that the man went to Carr's house after the murder with the killer to find some evidence that the killer left behind. It's believed that they were looking for the killer's underwear. They didn't find the underwear, but the police did. When the killer returned to Carr's house with his friend, they stabbed his dead body, and they also wrote the message on the wall. The police said that they have enough evidence to arrest the man who confessed to the two witnesses, but he died in 2003. His identity has never been made public, but he was 27 at the time of the murder. He was a native of Charlottetown, and he identified as bisexual. He had just been paroled before the murder, and he had a history of violence. While the man confessed to his involvement in the crime, he didn't name the actual killer. The police still don't know who he is. They think that at the time of the murder, he was 15 to 25 years old. He was probably living a high-risk lifestyle, and he was also probably committing low-level crimes. The police were able to pull DNA off the underwear that was left at the crime scene. Unfortunately, they have not been able to link the DNA to anyone. One possible clue is the message on the wall that he would kill again. The police think that he at least attempted to commit another murder. 2 months after Carr was killed, a man in Charlottetown picked up a young man in a local park. Carr was known to cruise the same park. The man said that he took the young man he met at the park back to his house. Once there, the young man pulled out a knife. The potential victim then ran out of the house, and he was able to escape unharmed. For 20 years, the man didn't report the incident, and then he finally went to the police. He spoke with the police sketch artist, and it resulted in this sketch. The police are not sure if this was the same man who killed Carr, but they think it's quite possible. The family of Byron Carr says that at this point, they don't expect justice, but they do want closure. Number 2, Genevieve Citricki. In the spring of 1990, 28-year-old Genevieve Citricki was living alone in an apartment in Greenville, South Carolina. She was recently divorced and worked as a computer programmer. April 4th was another mundane Wednesday, and at the end of the day, Citricki went to bed, expecting to wake up for work the next morning. Sometime during the night, a man forced her sliding back door open and entered the apartment. 2 days later, the police were called to her apartment by a maintenance man. Citricki was dead in the bathtub. The killer probably found Citricki asleep in bed. He beat her in the head with a small hammer that he brought with him. He then wrapped some pantyhose around her neck and dragged her into the bathtub. At some point, Citricki was sexually assaulted. The killer then ransacked the apartment. Above her dresser, there was a mirror. On the mirror, in magic marker, the killer had written, "Don't with my family." At the time, the police thought that, based on the message, she was killed by someone who she had an argument with, or someone who held a grudge against her. That proved to be a dead end, because they couldn't find anyone who wanted to hurt Citricki. The police found DNA evidence on Citricki, and in 1995, it was entered into a national database, but it wasn't linked to anyone. Several years would go by, and there was no progress on the case. Then in 2006, the DNA was matched to DNA taken from another series of unsolved crimes that happened on March 3, 1998, nearly 8 years after Citricki was killed. The series of crimes started over 550 miles away from Greenville, just outside Portageville, Missouri. On March 28, 1998, Tony Shearer and his son, Stephen, spent all day working in a farmer's field. On their way home, they stopped off at a friend's home. Stephen called his mother at 6:20 and spoke with her. Tony called home just after 6:30, and there was no answer. Tony and Stephen then drove home and found nothing unusual about the outside of the house. Inside, they found Tony's wife and Stephen's mother, 37-year-old Sherry, and the family's daughter, 12-year-old Megan, both dead. They were both tied up and gagged in the living room. They had been shot multiple times in the head with a .22 caliber handgun. Megan had been sexually assaulted, and this is where the DNA was pulled from. 2 hours after the mother and daughter were killed, about 40 miles away near Dyersburg, Tennessee, a man driving a full-size maroon van pulled up to a mobile home where a mother was home with her 3 children. It was a hot night and they had the door open, so anyone driving on the road could see the children playing in the trailer. The man said that he was lost and he was looking for a man named Jeremy Taylor. Suddenly, he pulled out a handgun. The mother fought for the gun and several shots went off. During the struggle, the mother was shot once. The man then fled in his van. The mother survived the shooting, and she was able to describe her attacker. She said he was 5'6" and slender. He had dark hair with gray in it, and he was probably over the age of 30. She also said that he had a northern accent. The ballistics on the bullets were matched to the bullets recovered from the murders of Sherry and Megan. This gave the police insight into how he may have gotten into Sherry and Megan's home. There were no signs of a forced entry at their house, so the police believe that he used a similar ploy of needing help and then pulled out a gun. Then in May 2017, the killer's DNA was connected to yet another crime. In 1997, 7 years after the murder of Citricki, and a year before Sherry and Megan were killed, he attacked a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee. He was able to talk his way into her home, and then he bound and sexually assaulted her. Luckily, he left her alive. The police and the FBI are not sure what the killer was doing during the 7 years between the murder of Citricki and the sexual assault in Memphis. One explanation is that he was in prison. Another explanation is that he didn't take a hiatus. Instead, he continued to commit assaults and possibly other murders. One reason they believe this is because the murder of Citricki was very different from the other attacks. He broke into her apartment, trashed it, wrote on the mirror, and Citricki was an adult. In the 3 attacks that occurred in 1997 and in 1998, he talked his way into the homes and either targeted children or the children were believed to be the targets. Profilers think that during those 7 years, he attacked other women and children, and these attacks led to an evolution in his modus operandi. The police in Greenville and the FBI do not think that the attack on Citricki was random, but they don't think that the writing on the mirror indicated that she had a personal problem with the killer. Profilers think that he wrote this to draw attention away from himself. Since the man was a serial killer that was developing his strategies, and he got away with this murder, he may have written messages at other crime scenes. The police think that as more DNA from other crime scenes is entered into the database, he'll be connected to more crimes. They hope that, eventually, they'll be able to identify the man who left the DNA. Number 1. Charles Morgan. On the morning of March 22, 1977, 43-year-old Charles Morgan left to go to work. He ran an escrow company in Tucson, Arizona. He didn't come home that night, but he wasn't reported missing. In fact, he didn't come home for 3 days. Around 2 o'clock on the morning of March 25th, his wife found him at the back door of their home. His wrists were bound with zip ties. He was missing a shoe and there was a plastic zip tie around one of his ankles. His wife got him inside and he indicated he couldn't talk. She got a pad of paper and a pen and he explained what happened. He wrote that he had been kidnapped. He also wrote that his throat had been sprayed with a hallucinogenic drug that could make him go crazy or kill him if he talked. Obviously, his wife wanted to go to the police and take him to the hospital, but he refused. Instead, he stayed home and rested until he could use his voice again. While he was resting, he told his wife that he secretly worked for the Treasury Department. He wrote that he was an agent and he was helping combat organized crime. At the time, because of the property laws in Arizona, the state had become a haven for organized crime syndicates to launder money. After the kidnapping, Morgan obviously became paranoid. He wore a bulletproof vest everywhere he went, and his belt buckle contained a hidden knife. He also started carrying a .357 Magnum revolver, and he kept several firearms in his car. He was also sure to drive his daughters to and from school. Then, almost 3 months later, on June 8th, Morgan went missing again. 9 days after he went missing, his wife received a strange phone call. It was a woman who didn't identify herself. She called his wife by her name and said that Charles was fine, and then said Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. She then hung up the phone. Morgan's wife looked up the passage. The modern English version of the passage reads, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years arrive when you say, 'I have no pleasure in them.' Before the sun, light, moon, and stars are darkened, and the clouds leave after the rain. In the day when those watching the house tremble, and the strong men are bent over. When the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows have dimmed eyes. And the doors on the street are shut, and the sound of grinding is low. And one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. When they are afraid of heights, even the terrors along the road. The almond tree blossoms, and the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails. Because man goes to his eternal home, and mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the cord of silver is snapped, or the bowl of gold is smashed, or the jar by the spring broken, or the wheel at the cistern crushed. The dust returns to the earth where it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. It is all vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity." 2 days after the call, and 11 days after Morgan went missing, his body was found near Sells, Arizona. He had been shot once in the head, and the sheriff's department ruled the death a suicide. Morgan's family, friends, members of the media, and some other investigators don't think his death was a suicide. It's important to point out that only the sheriff's department labeled the death a suicide. The medical examiner, on the other hand, didn't say if it was a suicide or a homicide, and instead labeled it an unsolved death. The first notable problem with the suicide theory is the way that Morgan was shot. Morgan was killed with his own gun, and it was found beside him. He was shot at the back of the head, near the top of the head. There was gunshot residue on his left hand, so the sheriff's department concluded that was the hand he used to shoot himself. The problem is that Morgan was right-handed. Why would he use his non-dominant hand to shoot himself in the back of the head? Another problem is that there were no fingerprints, not even Morgan's, found on the gun. For the 10 days he was missing, Morgan was hiding out in motel rooms. He died within 12 hours of being found. He was still wearing his bulletproof vest. Why would Morgan hide out for 11 days, drive out to the desert, and shoot himself in the back of the head with his non-dominant hand while wearing a bulletproof vest? There were also several oddities about the murder scene. The first is that, near the body, Morgan's tooth was found wrapped in a handkerchief. The second oddity and possible clue was found clipped to his underwear. It was an American $2 bill. On the back of the bill is an engraving of John Turnbull's painting, The Declaration of Independence. The television program, Unsolved Mysteries, said that the signers were numbered 1 to 7, however, it only appears that they are numbered 1 to 6. Also on the back of the $2 bill is a hand-drawn map of an area of Arizona. The map leads to Robles Junction and Sassabee, which are both towns in Arizona that were known routes for smuggling. Written on the front of the bill was 7 Spanish names. The initials of each name were A through G. Also written on the front of the bill was Ecclesiastes 12, and then arrows near the serial number indicating 1 through 8. Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8 is the same Bible passage the caller told Morgan's wife. What could a map of an area of Arizona, 6 founding fathers, 7 Spanish names, and a Bible verse written on a $2 bill possibly mean? Some investigators think that the bill was a code about who murdered him. It's possible that the message could have been meant for the Treasury Department or the FBI. They may have had a document or a file that corresponded with the written clues. If someone did decipher the code, that information has never been made public. 2 days after Morgan's body was found, the Sheriff's Department received an unusual phone call. It was a woman who only identified herself as Green Eyes. Green Eyes said that she visited Morgan in his motel room. He showed her a briefcase full of money. He said that it was $60,000 and he was trying to collect enough money to stop a contract hit on his life. The woman also admitted that she was the one who called Morgan's wife. She then hung up the phone. Unfortunately, Green Eyes has never been identified. When investigative reporter Don Devereaux looked into Morgan's financial dealings, he found out that he had done deals with at least 1, possibly 2, organized crime syndicates. One of Morgan's associates said that he kept a secret file on one of the syndicates. Morgan said it was his form of insurance. The secret file could be the reason that Morgan was kidnapped in March. He was kidnapped by the syndicate, and he was interrogated about the location of the file. After the kidnapping, Morgan found out that there was a contract on his life, and he collected enough money to try and buy off the hitman. He then drove out to the desert with the money to meet his killer. The hitman shot him and took the money. Backing up this theory is that shortly after the death, 2 men paid a visit to Morgan's widow. They flashed badges at her, and they said that they were with the FBI. They tore apart the house looking for something, but left without finding it. Don Devereaux made a Freedom of Information Act request for the FBI's file on Morgan. The FBI said that they had never heard of Morgan, and they didn't have any information on him. Despite a lot of circumstantial evidence, the Sheriff's Department still considers Charles Morgan's death a suicide. But the case may not end there. Morgan's bizarre death was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that aired on February 7, 1990. One of the people that they interviewed was Don Devereaux. 4 months after the episode aired, on March 14, 1990, there was a shooting in Phoenix, Arizona. A man named Doug Johnson, who worked at a computer graphic company, was found dead in his car outside of his work. Johnson had been shot in the back of the head, behind his left ear. The gun was probably fired a foot away from his head. The police originally thought that Johnson killed himself, but no gun was found at the site, and there was no gunshot residue on his hand. Johnson was right-handed, so if he did shoot himself, he probably would have shot himself behind the right ear, not the left. Devereaux thinks that Johnson was accidentally killed in a case of mistaken identity and that the bullet was meant for him. Johnson's office was across the road from his office. Johnson also drove a similar car to the one that Devereaux drove. No one has ever been arrested in connection with Johnson's death. Then in 1991, a year after Morgan's death, a freelance journalist working in Washington, D.C., named Daniel Castellero, got in contact with Devereaux. Castellero said that he had information on what Morgan was working on before he died. Before Devereaux and Castellero could meet, something tragic happened. In August 1991, Castellero traveled to Martinsburg, West Virginia, to meet a source for a story he was working on. The story was a vast government conspiracy called the Octopus. There were several aspects of the theory, but there were two main parts. The first aspect revolves around a computer program called the Prosecutor's Management Information System, or its acronym, PROMIS. PROMIS was designed to track criminal cases across the world. Supposedly, the Justice Department had the code modified so that they could spy on any other country that they sold the program to. The second aspect of the octopus theory is that in the lead up to the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Reagan's campaign team paid Iran $40 million to delay the release of hostages at the U.S. Embassy during the Iran hostage crisis. The delay would reflect poorly on Jimmy Carter, who was seeking re-election, but it would help Reagan, who had taken a strong stance against Iran. Sure enough, 20 minutes after Reagan made his inaugural address on January 20th, 1981, the hostages from the embassy were released. Nothing in the octopus theory has ever been proved with any sort of tangible evidence. On August 10th, Casellaro was staying in a hotel in Martinsburg. One of the maids at the hotel found his body in the bathtub. His wrists had been slashed a dozen times with a razor blade. His death was also ruled a suicide. Casellaro's family doesn't believe he killed himself for several reasons. The first is that Casellaro was afraid of blood, so even if he had taken his own life, he would have picked a less gory way to do it. Secondly, his brother said that 3 months before he died, Casellaro received death threats. Casellaro also told him that if he were to die in an accident, not to believe it, because he had been murdered. Finally, Casellaro's notes on the octopus disappeared around the same time that he died. The notes, which he accumulated over a year, have never been found. Despite the odd circumstances surrounding the deaths of all three men, their deaths are not considered homicides, and their cases are considered closed. Number 3. George Barron Black. On January 7, 1949, 52-year-old George Barron Black was working as a cashier at Lloyd's Bank in Bristol, England. It was a Friday afternoon, and that afternoon, only one other staff member was working. That was 18-year-old Donald Twitt, who was the assistant cashier. At around 2 p.m., a man who was about 25 years old walked into the bank. He was about 5'6" with a slim build. He was pale, he had a round face, he was clean-shaven, and he looked well-groomed. He was wearing horn-rimmed glasses, a green or gray trilby hat, and a dark overcoat. He was also carrying a briefcase. He asked Twitt if Mr. Murray had come in looking for him. He said that Mr. Murray was supposed to meet him at the bank. Twitt told the man that no one by that name had come into the bank. The man then said that he was going to wait for Mr. Murray. For the next hour, the mysterious man stood near the back of the bank while customers went in and out. One customer, a man named John Rowe, became suspicious of the man. At 3:09, he called 999 and told the dispatcher that he thought that something strange was happening in the bank. It turned out that he was right. After a vicar and a woman left the bank, the man was alone with Black and Twitt. He pulled out a gun and said, "This is a stick-up." Black decided to charge at the man. When he ran at the man pulled the trigger twice. Both bullets found their mark. One bullet entered Black's chest, and the other entered his abdomen. He fell to the ground, and he was dead within a minute. The man then locked Twitt in a cloakroom, and he put 1,444 pounds into his briefcase. He walked quickly out of the bank, and John Rowe spotted him rushing away. Rowe asked him why he was in a hurry, and the robber said that he had collected a debt. As he got into his car, in Austin 16, Rowe tried to stop him from closing the car door. The robber punched Rowe in the face, which caused him to let go of the door, and then he drove off. The altercation attracted the attention of another witness who saw the robber's face as well. As he was driving away, Rowe was able to write down the license plate. The police arrived a few minutes after he made his escape. It wasn't long before the police concluded that the robber was an amateur. They figured out that he stole the car 4 hours before the robbery. 2 hours before he robbed the bank, he was seen at another bank that wasn't far away. It's thought that he showed up at the wrong bank. When he got to the correct bank, he stood around for over an hour, so Twit got a good look at him, as did several customers. As he stood in the bank, he left the stolen car parked out front for over an hour. He also drew attention to himself by punching Rowe, so there was no shortage of people who could give a description of the man. The gun he used was quite uncommon in England. It was a .32 caliber. Despite the police's best efforts, the gun was never found. Finally, he left a clue at the crime scene. Using a pen that was on a table at the back of the bank, the killer wrote this note. It reads, "See you Monday at 2. Missed you today. Joe. Waited until 3 p.m. The police are pretty sure that the man wrote the note as part of his pretext that he was waiting at the bank to meet Mr. Murray. The police were hoping that someone would recognize the handwriting, but no one did. Banknotes from the robbery were used throughout England, but never led to an arrest. Despite allowing several people to get a good look at him and leaving a note with his handwriting at the crime scene, the killer has never been caught. So while he may have been an amateur criminal, he not only got away with the robbery, but a cold-blooded murder as well. Number 2. Donna Lass. In the early morning hours of September 6, 1970, 25-year-old Donna Lass was working at the Sahara Hotel Casino in South Lake Tahoe, California. She worked as a registered nurse at the casino's first aid station. She wrote her last log at 1:50 a.m. Later that day, Donna was supposed to meet a friend who drove from San Francisco. However, her friend couldn't get a hold of her, so she drove back to San Francisco. The next day, a man called Lass's work and her landlord. The caller, who didn't identify himself, said that Lass had a family emergency and she would be away. But there was no family emergency. Lass's mother didn't know that anything was wrong until she received a call from an unknown person on September 8th, 12 days after her daughter went missing. The police went to her apartment, which was about a half a mile away from the casino in State Line, Nevada. They found her apartment locked. They got inside and there were no signs of a disturbance and nothing was missing. Lass's car was found near her apartment building. It too was locked and showed no signs of a disturbance. It's believed that Lass left work and drove home. She was then kidnapped as she walked from her car to her apartment building. Unfortunately, Donna Lass has never been found. It's as if she vanished into thin air after she stepped out of her car. 6 months after Lass went missing, on March 22, 1971, a postcard was mailed to Paul Avery at the San Francisco Chronicle. Avery was a reporter at the Chronicle, and he covered the Zodiac murders extensively. The Zodiac is suspected of killing at least 5 people between December 1968 and October 1969 in Northern California. The Zodiac was famous for sending cryptic letters to the newspapers in the areas where he committed his murders. The postcard that was sent to Avery was made from an illustration from a flyer for a condominium development. The condos are called Forest Pines, and they are located in Incline, Nevada. Incline is across Lake Tahoe from State Line, Nevada, where Lass was most likely kidnapped. 5 phrases that were made up from words cut from magazines and newspapers were pasted on the postcard. The 5 phrases were Sierra Club, saw it victim 12, peek through the pines, past Lake Tahoe areas. Then there's the phrase around in the snow, which is pasted upside down. There is also a hole punched in the top right-hand corner. Finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, there is the symbol that the Zodiac used to sign his letters. Since there were several references to Lake Tahoe, and Donna Lass worked and lived near Lake Tahoe, some investigators believe that the postcard is the Zodiac taking credit for her murder. Some investigators believe that it's a clue to where her body is located. Whether or not that is true is unknown, because Deborah Lass's body has never been found. But there are several oddities that do link the Zodiac to Lass's disappearance. The first is the day that she disappeared. An alternative to the Gregorian calendar is the moon calendar. The moon calendar also has 7-day weeks, but the months are only 28 days, meaning there are 13 months instead of 12. The names of the days of the week are also different. For example, the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd days of the month in the moon calendar are called Dali. Because both calendars have 7-day weeks, the Gregorian calendar and the moon calendar can be lined up. For example, July 1st, 2018, which is a Sunday in the Gregorian calendar, is called Alpha in the moon calendar. Donna Lass went missing on September 6, 1970, which is Dali in the moon calendar. All 5 of the Zodiac's confirmed victims were also killed on Dali. According to the television show The Hunt for the Zodiac Killer, the chance that all 6 murders happened on Dali is 1 in 20,000. Another odd, possible clue arrived in the mail 4 years after Donna Lass went missing. On December 27, 1974, Lass's sister, Mary Pilker, who lived in Sioux Falls, North Dakota, found an envelope in her mailbox. The postmark on the envelope was San Francisco, California. In the envelope was a Christmas card. It is a winter scene of pine trees against a blue background. Inside the card it reads, "Holiday greetings and best wishes for a happy new year." Then it's signed, "Best wishes, St. Donna and Guardian of the Pines." The Christmas card was bizarre enough for Pilker to turn the card over to the police. There is one last major way that Donna Lass is connected to the Zodiac case. She supposedly knew one of the primary suspects. That is Lawrence Kane. Kane is considered a suspect for several reasons. For example, he studied cryptology while he served in the Navy. In 1962, before the Zodiac murders began, Kane suffered a head injury in a car accident. The injury supposedly impaired his ability to control his impulses. After the head injury, he was arrested several times for being a peeping Tom and for prowling. The sister of Darlene Ferrin, the Zodiac's 5th confirmed victim, saw a photograph of Kane and said she recognized him. Darlene Ferrin worked at a restaurant, and her sister said that the man in the photograph harassed her at work before she died. Also, Kane lived close to where the last confirmed Zodiac victim, Paul Stein, was killed. An officer who was near the Stein crime scene said that he saw a man who looked like Kane walking away from the crime scene. After Paul Stein was killed, Kane moved to South Lake Tahoe, and he worked in a real estate office down the hallway from the first aid station where Donna Lass worked and was last seen alive. Lawrence Kane was never charged with any crimes connected to the Zodiac, and he died in 2010. Some people are not convinced that the Zodiac is responsible for Donna Lass's disappearance. There is some speculation that the postcard is a hoax, and it was created by an investigator who worked on the Zodiac case. That could have possibly been Dave Toschi, who was one of the lead investigators on the Zodiac case. He was taken off the case after it was discovered that he was sending anonymous letters to reporter Paul Avery. In the letters, Tashi would praise himself. He was suspected of sending some of the Zodiac letters, but the San Francisco Police Department point out that there is no evidence that he wrote any letters posing as the Zodiac. Detective Tashi died in January 2018. A problem with the theory that Donald Lass was killed by the Zodiac is that Lass's disappearance doesn't fit the Zodiac's pattern. Notably, none of his confirmed victims were kidnapped and their bodies were all found. Unfortunately, we may never know with any certainty if Donald Lass was killed by the Zodiac. Someone else who is a person of interest in the disappearance of Donald Lass is Philip Garrido. Philip was born in California, but in 1970, when he was 19 years old, he moved to Reno, Nevada, which is less than 60 miles away from where Donald Lass was last seen. Shortly after he moved to Reno, Lass disappeared. 6 years later, Philip kidnapped a casino worker in South Lake Tahoe. He took her to a warehouse in Reno that he had set up with a rug, a movie projector, wine, and porno magazines. Over the course of 5.5 hours, he sexually assaulted the woman. A police officer on patrol happened to see a car near the warehouse's door, and he saw that the lock on the door appeared to be broken. He started banging on the door, and Philip opened it. When he opened the door, the woman started screaming. Philip was immediately arrested. He was convicted of kidnapping and transporting his victim over a state line. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison, and he was sent to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas to serve his term. While in prison, he met Nancy Bocanegra, who was visiting her uncle. They started a relationship, and in October 1981, while Philip was still in prison, he and Nancy married. Philip was paroled in 1988, and then he and Nancy moved in with his mother in Antioch, California. On June 10, 1991, Philip and Nancy kidnapped 11-year-old JC Dugard as she walked to school in Myers, California, which is just south of South Lake Tahoe. They took her back to their home, and for years she was held in a makeshift soundproof recording studio and tents and sheds in the backyard. At times she could go into the house, but she had to wear handcuffs. During her years of captivity, she suffered horrifying physical, mental, and sexual abuse. She also gave birth to 2 daughters without any medical supervision. One was born when she was 14, and the second daughter was born when she was 17. Her daughters were forced to live in the backyard with her. Then on August 24, 2009, Philip and the 2 daughters that he had with JC went to the campus of UC Berkeley. Philip talked to a university official about holding a religious service on campus. The university official thought that the trio was acting oddly, so she contacted the police. At the time, Philip was still on parole for kidnapping the casino worker in 1976. The police spoke with his parole officer, and the parole officer was amazed to learn that Philip had kids. The parole officer called Philip in for an interview, and he brought JC and their 2 daughters. JC said that her name was Alyssa, and her daughters were relatives. After some prodding, Philip confessed to kidnapping JC, and JC admitted who she was. Both Philip and Nancy were arrested, and after 18 years in captivity, JC was reunited with her family. Amazingly, even though Philip had been on parole the entire time JC was in captivity, and parole officers had been to his house 60 times, no one had ever done a thorough search of his property. Had they done so, they would have found evidence of JC and her 2 daughters. Philip was sentenced to 431 years in prison, and Nancy was sentenced to 36 years. The problem with the theory of Philip Garrido being responsible for Donald Lass's disappearance is that Lass's kidnapper presumably killed her. Philip kidnapped and sexually assaulted his victims, but as far as the police know, he has not killed anyone. Other people point out that it's unclear what he planned to do with the casino worker that he kidnapped and sexually assaulted in 1976 had the police officer not interrupted him. Philip Garrido has never been publicly named as a suspect in Donna Lass's disappearance, but Lass's family wonders if he is the one responsible for her disappearance. Unfortunately, unless Donna Lass's remains are found, or someone confesses to kidnapping her, her family may never know what happened to her. Number 1. The Southern Pacific Axeman. Rayne is a small town in Louisiana. In 1909, it was home to about 2,000 people. At about 1 a.m. on November 13, 1909, the quiet of the night was shattered by the screams of a woman and her children. People rushed to the source of the screams. It was the home of Edna Opalupis and her 3 children. Inside the house, people found Edna dead, and her children, who ranged in age from 4 to 9, were all mortally wounded. They died later in the hospital. Edna's skull had been split open with an axe, and her children had also been hacked with an axe. A man named George Washington was arrested, but the murders didn't stop. Walter Byers, his wife Sylvania, and their son lived in Crowley, Louisiana, which is about 8 miles from Rayne. Walter was known as a hard-working and peaceful man. He worked at a rice mill, and he was the secretary at his church. On January 27, 1911, the police were called to their home because a distinctive smell was emanating from it. The doors were locked from the inside, so the police forced their way in. They found Walter and Sylvania dead in bed, and their 6-year-old son was dead at the foot of their bed. They had been dead at least 3 days. They had all been struck once in the head with an axe, most likely while they slept. A bloody axe was found at the head of the bed. The police think that the killer, or killers, climbed through an unlocked window, killed the family while they slept, then washed up in a basin, and then climbed back out the window. A month went by, and no arrests were made. Then on the morning of February 24, 1911, a woman went to her brother's home in Lafayette, Louisiana, and found the kitchen door wide open. She thought that was odd, so she went inside. Her brother, Alexander Andrus, and his family were dead. The killer came through the kitchen door, which was unlocked. He killed Alexander and his wife Mimi in their beds with a single whack to the head with an axe. Their 3-year-old son Joachim was killed in his bed, and their 11-year-old daughter Agnes had her skull crushed in her crib. After the family was dead, the killer moved the bodies. He positioned Alexander and Mimi so that they were on their knees at the side of the bed. It looked like they were praying. Then lying beside Mimi on the bed was baby Agnes's body. After slaughtering the family, the killer walked back out the kitchen door and into the night. Another month went by and no one was arrested. Now, on March 22, 1911, over 400 miles away from the last massacre in San Antonio, Texas, a 4th family was found murdered with an axe. 52-year-old Alfred Lewis Cassaway, along with his wife, 37-year-old Elizabeth, and their children, 6-year-old Jose, 3-year-old Luis, and Alfred, who was 5 months old, were all found in the same room in their house. They died from severe head injuries that were caused by the blunt side of an axe. The murders of the Cassaways was slightly different from the previous mass murders. Before the Cassaways, all the victims were African American. This time, Elizabeth, who was Alfred's wife and the mother of the 3 children, was white. Otherwise, the murders were very similar. Someone snuck into the house in the middle of the night and wiped out the entire family with an axe. 6 months after the murders in San Antonio, the sheriff in Lafayette, Louisiana got a tip. A woman, who was only identified as Diana, told a friend that she thought her boyfriend, Raymond Barnabet, could have killed Alexander Andrus and his family. Diane's friend then told the sheriff to investigate Raymond. The sheriff questioned Raymond, and he denied killing anyone. The sheriff then went and talked to Raymond's former wife and his son, Zephyrin, and his daughter, Clementine. Raymond was an abusive alcoholic, and his former wife and children didn't like him. When Zephyrin and Clementine were interviewed by the sheriff, they said that they were positive that their father killed the Andrus family. They told the sheriff that on the night the family was killed, their father came home between 2 and 4 a.m. and he was covered in blood. They say he forced them to hide the evidence, and he made Clementine wash his bloody clothes. Based on their statements, Raymond was arrested and charged with the murder of the Andrus family. He went to trial a month after he was arrested, and his children testified against him. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death. His lawyers immediately filed an appeal, and they won. It turned out that Raymond was drunk during his trial. He was granted a new trial, but he had to stay in prison while he waited for his second trial. On November 27, 1911, while Raymond was in prison, the police were called to another home in Lafayette. Yet another family had been killed with an axe. Norbert Randall Sr., his wife Azima, their 4 children, Albert, who was 8, 6-year-old Renee, 5-year-old Norbert Jr., and 2-year-old Agnes, had all been slaughtered in their home. Their bodies were on 2 beds in one room. Some of the children were killed in a different room, and then they were moved into the room with the rest of their family. Norbert Sr. had been shot before his head was caved in with an axe. The axe had been cleaned, and was resting against the wall near the head of the beds. The day after the bodies were discovered, the sheriff arrested Raymond's children, Clementine and Zephyrin. Sheriff's deputies searched 18-year-old Clementine's bedroom, and they took one of her dresses. While Clementine was in custody, the sheriff asked her if she was involved in the murders. He pointed out that the dress the deputies found had blood and human brains on it. Clementine simply laughed and said no. The sheriff theorized that Clementine was the person who killed the family. The problem with the theory was that Clementine was a slight 18-year-old. She would not have been able to move the dead bodies herself. The sheriff thought that her brother must have helped her, and he was arrested as well. However, they never found any evidence that Zephyrin was involved in the massacre, so he was released, and Clementine and Raymond remained incarcerated. Clementine originally said that she was innocent, but 2 days after her arrest, while she was on the witness stand, she said she killed the Randall family. She also said that she was the leader of a cult. She was a member of a church called the Christ Sanctified Holy Church. She said that within the church, there was a smaller group called the Church of Sacrifice, and she was the leader of that group. Clementine said that the recently murdered Azima Randall had been a member of the cult. Clementine said that she killed Azima and her family because she disobeyed the cult's orders. Clementine also said that a local voodoo doctor gave her a charm that would protect her from punishment. Because of her odd stories, she was examined to see if she was sane. A big problem with Clementine's confession is that she didn't know anything specific about the murders. Also, the murders didn't stop while she was in prison. 2 months after she was arrested, the police were called to a home in Crowley, Louisiana. On the morning of January 12, 1912, Harriet Crane stopped off at her daughter's home. She found the home disturbingly quiet, so she got a neighbor to go inside. Inside the house, he found the dead bodies of Crane's daughter, Marie Warner, and her 3 children, 9-year-old Pearl, 8-year-old Harriet, and 7-year-old Gary. They had all been killed with axe blows to the head while they slept. The children were killed in their own bedroom, and then they were moved into Marie's bedroom. The axe was found in the bedroom. It was covered in blood. The police instantly had a suspect, and that was Zephyrin. He was arrested within hours of the discovery of the bodies. With all three family members in jail, the people of Louisiana started to breathe a little easier. But then the day after Marie Warner and her children were killed, another family was slaughtered. The Broussards lived in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is about 50 miles from Crowley. Felix and Matilda Broussard, along with their three children, 8-year-old Margaret, 6-year-old Alberta, and 3-year-old Louis, had all been killed with the blunt side of an axe. Felix and Matilda were found in their own room. Their children were found in another bedroom. The children's bodies were all in the same bed, and there was a bucket under the bed to collect the blood. Also under the bed was a bloody axe. At this crime scene, the police found something unusual. There was a message written in pencil on the kitchen door. It read, "When he maketh inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble." Then to the side, it said Human 5. Some newspapers said it read Human, 5. Newspapers at the time said it was a passage from the Bible, Psalms 9:12. But that isn't exactly accurate. The quote is from the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it is a misquote of Psalms 9:12. The passage from the Bible reads, "When he maketh inquisition for blood, he remembereth them, he forgetteth not the cry." The words Human 5 are not part of the psalm. The police, and researchers who have investigated the crime over the past century, are unsure what the quote or what the words Human 5 mean. Some people think that Human 5 refers to the number of people who died that night. Other people thought that Human 5 was the name of the gang that killed the family and possibly the other families as well. What is clear is that the Barnabette family didn't kill the Broussards because they were still in jail. Yet, even though she was locked up, Clementine confessed to killing the Broussards. She said she wanted to kill families of 5 because she said that the number 5 had significance in voodoo. What is odd about Clementine's statement is that the Broussard family was only the second family of 5 to be killed up to that point. About a month after the Broussard family was killed, and while the Barnabettes were still in jail, a family in Beaumont, Texas was killed with an axe. Sometime after midnight on February 19, 1912, 30-year-old Hattie Dove, her children, 18-year-old Jesse, 16-year-old Ethel, and 14-year-old Ernest, were killed in their home. Ernest and his mother were found in one room. The two daughters, who were in another bedroom, may have put up a struggle, but they were ultimately killed. The killer found the axe outside the family's home, and after he was finished killing the family, he wiped it clean with a cloth. He left both the axe and the cloth he used to clean it at the crime scene. On March 27, 1912, a month after the last family was killed, yet another family was slaughtered. This massacre took place in Gildan, Texas. The victims were 37-year-old Lyle Finucane, his common-law wife Ellen Monroe, and 4 of her children, Willie, 16, Jesse, 12, Dewey, 13, and Alberta, 8. Lyle and Ellen were found in their bedroom, lying on the floor. The children's bodies were all in their beds. They had been attacked while they were sleeping. Their right temples had been crushed with the blunt side of an axe. After killing the family, the killer partially wiped down the axe and washed up in a basin. He then walked out the back door and into the night. The police found shoe prints behind the home. The police brought in bloodhounds and led them to the home of Jim Fields and his wife, Ida Booker. The newlywed couple lived near the family. Their shoes were wet, so the police thought that they had recently been washed. Fields' shoes were compared to the shoe prints at the crime scene, and they were a match. Fields had $30 on him, and the police thought that was a lot of money for an African American to have on him. A $10 bill he had in his possession had blood on it. So Jim Fields was arrested. With the Barnabots and now Jim Fields locked up, the black communities in Louisiana and Texas were hoping that the killings were finally going to stop. Then on April 2nd, 1912, Clementine made a startling confession to her reporter. She said that more families were marked for death. 2 days later, she appeared in front of the grand jury, where she admitted to killing 17 people. She said that she and 4 friends bought some charms from a voodoo doctor. The charms were supposed to protect them from being arrested. Then they started killing people as sacrifices to their cult, and they killed anyone who disobeyed the cult's orders. The police tracked down the 4 friends that Clementine said were in her cult. All 4 friends had alibis, where they were able to easily prove that they weren't involved in the murders of the families. After being indicted, Clementine was sent back to prison to await her trial. A week after Clementine told the reporter that more families were marked for death, there was yet another mass murder of a family. This family lived in San Antonio, Texas, about 2 blocks away from where the Castaway family was killed 10 months earlier. William and Carrie Burton lived with their 2 children, Edward and Naomi, and Carrie's brother, Leon Evers. Once again, everyone in the house was killed with an axe, but this murder was slightly different. Both William and Leon had been hacked in the back with a butcher knife, in addition to being struck with the axe. 2 nights later, there was another murder. Sometime after midnight on April 12, 1912, a person broke into a home in Hampstead, Texas. In the home were Ike Burney, 2 of his adult daughters, Carrie Burney and Alice Marshall, and 3 of his grandchildren. The sounds of the Axeman attacking Alice Marshall awoke a young family member who was in the same room, and she started screaming. She was hit with the Axeman's weapon, but then she was able to roll under her bed, and the Axeman stopped attacking her. Her screams woke up 2 young boys who were in the house. They got out of the house safely, and the Axeman made his escape. Alice, Ike, and Carrie died later in the hospital. This was the first time that the Axeman allowed any potential victims to escape. It was also the first time that he didn't use a regular-sized axe. The murder weapon was either a hatchet or a small axe. At this point, the panic in black communities in Texas and Louisiana was at a fever pitch. Newspapers at the time promoted the idea that a voodoo cult was hunting down families. 2 days after the triple murder, a young black man in Smithville, Texas, got up in the middle of the night. He walked out of his home to stretch his legs, and he was shot. The shooter was someone who was guarding his house, and he thought that the young man was the Axeman. A neighbor heard the gunshot, and he thought it was a sign of the Axeman. He ran towards the gunshot, and then changed his mind and started to walk back home. As he walked, he was shot by another neighbor who thought that he was the Axeman. Both men who were accidentally shot died because of their wounds. A month after the triple murder, where the Axeman allowed 3 potential victims to escape, James Fields went to trial for the murder of Lyle Finucane. He had spent the 2 months between his arrest and his trial in jail. When Fields was arrested, he had wet shoes, which were apparently wet after he washed blood off them, and his shoes matched shoe prints that were left near the back door of the crime scene. He also had $30 on him, and a $10 bill that was in his possession had blood on it. Fields' lawyer pointed out that having wet shoes did not indicate that he killed anyone. Also, the shoe prints were found outside the house where Finucane, his common-law wife, and her children were killed, but his shoe prints weren't found inside. Fields explained he had just cashed a check for $42, and then he purchased something, and that was when he was given the $10 bill with blood on it. Fields' lawyer presented witnesses who verified these transactions. Finally, his lawyer pointed out that while Fields was in jail, 2 families were attacked with an axe. Fields was acquitted, and he was held in jail until July, when the rest of the murder charges against him were dropped. Early on the morning of August 16, 1912, a man crawled through the window where James and Lula Daschle were sleeping in their home in San Antonio, Texas. About 3 months earlier, someone had tried to break into their home while they were sleeping, but he was unsuccessful. This time, the intruder got into the house. Once he was inside, he swung an axe at Lula's head. He missed her head, but hit her in the arm. That single blow nearly severed her arm. She woke up screaming, and instead of trying to kill the family while they were awake, the axeman fled. 3 months after that attack, in October 1912, Clementine went to trial for only one of the murders. She had confessed to that murder and 16 other ones. Regardless, her lawyer valiantly defended her. He pointed out that there was only one piece of evidence that connected her to any of the murders, and that was her dress that was stained with blood and human brains. Her lawyer pointed out that after the dress was picked up by the sheriff, it was thrown into a bundle with evidence that was taken from the crime scene. This would have made it very easy for blood and brain matter to be transferred to the dress. Clementine was ultimately found guilty on October 25, 1912, and she was sentenced to life the next day. Less than a month later, on November 22, 1912, the police were called to a home in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Sally Walmsley and her 4-year-old child were found dead inside their home. They had been whacked in the head with an axe. The most obvious suspect was William Walmsley, who was Sally's husband and father to the child. But that changed when his body was found about 100 yards from the house. It appeared he tried to run away, but he stopped at a fence. He pulled a picket off the fence and tried to use it as a weapon. Unfortunately, he couldn't fend off his attacker. He was killed with an axe blow to the head. When his body was found, he was still clutching the fence picket. After crossing the state line into Mississippi, the axe murders suddenly came to an end. Between November 1909 and November 1912, there were 12 home invasions, and 52 men, women, and children were killed. Some people believe that Claire Barnabet's voodoo cult, the Sacrifice Church, was responsible for the murders. While no other supposed cult members were arrested, the police did find something unusual after they interviewed a preacher who supposedly worked with Clementine's cult. He had a passage underlined in his Bible. It was Matthew 3:10, which reads, "Even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." The preacher was never identified. He was never charged in connection with a string of massacres. Clementine ended up serving 10 years in prison, and then she was paroled. What happened to her after she was paroled is unknown, but it's believed she moved away and changed her name. Many modern researchers do not think that Clementine was involved in the murders at all. They think that she was a mentally ill woman who falsely confessed because of pressure from the police. When she was arrested, she was a slight 18-year-old. It would not have taken a lot of effort for the police to manipulate or bully her into confessing. There's also several problems with the theory that Clementine was the Axeman. For example, she didn't know any specific details about the murders. Secondly, she would not have been physically able to kill the families and position their bodies after death. One way she would have been able to kill the families and move the bodies is if she got help from her supposed cult. But at the crime scenes, there was no evidence that more than one person was involved in the murders. Also, all the surviving witnesses said that they saw one person. Most researchers don't think that there was a cult at all, and Clementine just made it up under police pressure. The police and many people in the general public believed her story because some of the murders seemed to have religious overtones, like the kneeling couple and what they thought was a Bible quote. Today, many researchers think that, despite the distance between the crime scenes, that one man was responsible for all the murders. They think this because all the murders took place within a few miles of the railroad. It's believed that the Axeman traveled the Southern Pacific Railroad and then would kill families who lived close to the railroad. There was some speculation that the killer was targeting families that had mixed-race members, and the motive behind the murder spree was to kill people who didn't have, quote, pure blood, unquote. This has led the series of murders to be called the Mulatto Murders. Several of the families did have a mixed-race person, or in the case of the Castaways, who was the fourth family to be killed, the mother was white. But since the Axeman was never captured, it's impossible to say what his motives were for targeting the families that he killed. No description of the Axeman was ever made public. One theory is that the Axeman didn't stop killing after November 1912. Instead, he took a break and popped up 6 years later in New Orleans, Louisiana. Between May 1918 and October 1919, a man broke into several homes in New Orleans. Using axes that he found at his victims' homes, he attacked 18 people. In total, he killed 6 people and injured 12. In one incident, he killed a husband, a wife, and their toddler. While there are many similarities between the series of murders, most experts don't think that one person is responsible for both. The New Orleans Axeman often attacked couples or individuals. He did not target families like the Southern Pacific Axeman. Also, the Southern Pacific Axeman attacked black or mulatto families, whereas the New Orleans Axeman attacked mostly Italian immigrants. Since the Axemen were never captured, it's unknown if they are the same person. In our next edition of Unsolved Mysteries with Mysterious Letters, we'll cover the Axeman of New Orleans, and you can decide for yourself if the two series of murders are connected. Number 3. Carolyn Montgomery. In July 1971, 28-year-old Carolyn Montgomery got a job as a cocktail waitress at the North Dallas Country Club. Carolyn and her husband were divorced, and she had custody of their only child, 6-year-old DeQuinn. Carolyn and DeQuinn lived with a female roommate who was around the same age as Carolyn. They lived in a unique building complex in Dallas called the Sherwood Forest Apartments. It was unique because parts of the complex resembled a castle. On the night of August 7, 1971, Carolyn's roommate was away visiting her parents. That night, Carolyn went to work, and 6-year-old DeQuinn stayed home alone. Carolyn worked until about 1:30 a.m., and then she went home. The next morning, DeQuinn got up, and he found his mother lying on the living room floor. A blanket had been placed over her. DeQuinn was 6, and he just assumed that his mother was sick. So he went outside and rode his bike with some other kids who lived in the complex. DeQuinn told some of the kids that his mother was sick, and one of the other mothers heard him. She decided to go check on Carolyn. She found the 28-year-old single mother dead on the living room floor with a blanket placed over her. The woman called the police. The crime scene was shocking, even to veteran homicide detectives. Carolyn's throat had been slashed, her breasts were mutilated, and her chest had been cut open. The investigators concluded that the murder weapons were kitchen knives taken from Carolyn's kitchen. One was a foot-long butcher knife, and it was still lodged in her neck. Another knife that was used was a 4-inch steak knife, and it was embedded in her abdomen. The police found no evidence of a break-in or forced entry. Also, neither the neighbors nor DeQuinn heard a disturbance or someone trying to break in. This led the police to think that Carolyn knew her killer. It's believed that after the murder, the killer stayed in the apartment, possibly for several hours. He even brought in the newspaper that morning. He also took the time to write a message. On the cardboard backing from a photo frame, he wrote, "The wrong one, I'm sorry." The piece of cardboard was found resting on a chair near the body. Despite what the note said, the police do not think that Carolyn was killed in a case of mistaken identity. The police think that Carolyn talked to her killer before he attacked her. So they think it's doubtful he meant to kill someone else and accidentally butchered Carolyn. They think it's more plausible that he meant the wrong one because Carolyn was a stand-in for another woman in his life. He may have wanted to kill his mother or his romantic partner, and he took his rage out on Carolyn instead. The police could not find anyone who would have wanted to hurt Carolyn. They were quickly able to eliminate all the usual suspects, like her ex-husband. The police could verify where he was at the time of the murder. Another possibility was that the real target was Carolyn's roommate. This would explain the note and why the killer stayed in the apartment after the murder. He was waiting for the roommate to come home because he didn't realize she was spending the night at her parents' home. The police investigated this angle. They learned that the morning before the murder, there had been a disturbance at the apartment. A male bartender was there visiting Carolyn's roommate. A 20-year-old woman who knew the bartender came to the apartment and kicked the door open. She threatened Carolyn, Carolyn's roommate, and the bartender, and then she left. The 20-year-old woman was questioned by police, and she denied committing the murder. The police were able to clear her as a suspect as well because she had an alibi. The police also think that Carolyn let the killer into her apartment, and it's doubtful she would have allowed the woman who had threatened her to come into the apartment. The lead detective on the case thought that the killing was too brutal and the killer was too calm for it to be the only murder he ever committed. Typically, killers don't hang around the crime scene, possibly for hours, after the murder. For most killers, the natural response is to flee. Carolyn's killer possibly stayed in the apartment for hours. He took the time to write a note, and he brought in the paper. The detective thinks that the killer may have been a transient or a drifter who was traveling through Dallas. Or the killer may have been arrested for another crime. But this is all speculation because no other leads emerge in the case. Carolyn's son, DeQuinn, says he is still haunted by his mother's murder, and he remembers that morning vividly. He wants the case to be solved. He thinks that the killer is a monster. Some forensic evidence was collected, but in the nearly 50 years since the murder, a lot of it has been contaminated. Unless someone comes forward with information, the murder of Carolyn Montgomery may never be solved. Number 2. Ricky McCormick. In the summer of 1999, Ricky McCormick was 41 years old, and he lived in St. Louis, Missouri. McCormick had dropped out of high school, and he was semi-literate. According to his family, he could barely write his own name. But one thing McCormick liked to do was create ciphers. His family said he started doing it when he was a child, and he continued to make ciphers into his adulthood. McCormick had a criminal record. He had drug charges, and he had served 3 years of prison for statutory rape. McCormick had never married, and he had at least 4 children. In the summer of 1999, McCormick worked some odd jobs, and he also had a part-time job at a gas station. He also collected some disability money. Altogether, he made several $100s every month. On June 15, 1999, McCormick traveled from St. Louis to Orlando, Florida on a Greyhound bus. He stayed 2 nights at an Econo Lodge motel and then he returned to St. Louis. It was the second trip he had recently taken to Florida. On June 22nd, a few days after McCormick returned to St. Louis, he went to the hospital complaining of chest pains. McCormick had chronic heart and lung problems. He stayed in the hospital for 2 days and then he was discharged. The next day, he went to a different hospital in St. Louis because he was having problems breathing. But this time, he was not admitted into the hospital. On June 26, McCormick talked to his girlfriend on the phone. On June 27th, McCormick was seen at the gas station where he worked. After that, Ricky McCormick went missing. However, because of his lifestyle, no one reported him missing. 3 days later, on June 30th, 2 women were driving by a cornfield outside West Elton, Missouri. They noticed something odd beside the stalks of corn. It turned out to be a decomposing dead body. The body was fingerprinted, and the next day, it was determined that it was the body of 41-year-old Ricky McCormick. Initially, the medical examiner could not determine a cause of death, so the police thought that McCormick's death was natural. After all, McCormick had chronic health problems, and he had gone to the hospital twice in the week before he died. But the police noticed some odd things about Ricky McCormick's death. For example, McCormick did not drive or own a car. Yet, his body was found 15 miles from his home in a rural area that had no public transit. Also, because of his health issues, it's unlikely that he walked there. So how did McCormick's body end up beside the cornfield? Also, something odd was found in the pockets of McCormick's jeans. It was 2 pieces of paper that had handwriting on them. In total, there are about 30 lines of what appears to be, at first glance, random numbers and letters. Because of the oddities, the major case squad of Greater St. Louis investigated the death. A more thorough autopsy was performed. The medical examiner said that McCormick's throat could have been slashed. 25 investigators worked on the case, but they did not come any closer to figuring out what happened to Ricky McCormick. They thought if he was murdered, it may have been related to drugs. One reason they thought this was because McCormick had a criminal record involving drugs. Also, he had recently taken 2 mysterious trips to Florida, where he only stayed a couple days before returning to St. Louis. The last trip was 2 weeks before his death. However, the investigators did not learn anything about McCormick's trips, other than that he paid for cash for the bus tickets and the motel rooms. The investigators had no idea what the writing on the papers meant, if they meant anything at all. St. Louis has one of the highest murder rates in the United States, so after a few weeks, the investigators were forced to move on to other cases. Ricky McCormick's murder became cold, and it seemed like it would be forgotten. 12 years went by. Then in April 2011, the FBI announced that they had been investigating the death of Ricky McCormick. They said that his death was most likely a homicide. They also said that the writing in the notes was not random, and they think it is actually some type of cipher. The FBI's cryptanalysis and racketeering unit, known by the acronym CRRU, have been trying to decipher the code. They said that they are sure that there are patterns and sequences in the notes. For example, the letter E appears often. There are also references to the numbers 71, 74, and 75, and there is a repetition of the letters NCBE. In an attempt to crack the code, the CRRU used highly sophisticated software, but the software did not provide any clues as to what the notes might say. The CRRU had at least 15 experts examine the code, and none of them could solve it. In 2009, 2 years before going public with the notes, the FBI asked the American Cryptogram Association for some assistance. The members of the association were not aware that the notes were connected to the murder of Ricky McCormick. They discussed the notes at their annual meeting. But like the FBI's CRRU, they could not crack the code. So in April 2011, the FBI went public with the notes, and they are asking the public for help deciphering it. But it's been nearly a decade since they went public, and still, the code has not been cracked. The FBI is hoping to decipher the notes, as it may solve the mystery as to what happened to Ricky McCormick. It is believed that the notes were written a few days before he died. There are several theories about who wrote the notes. The first is that the killer wrote it and planted it on McCormick, possibly to throw off the police. The authorities think that this is the least likely explanation. In 1999, there were 129 other murders in the St. Louis area. That's a murder every 2.8 days. Arguably, McCormick's death, which was initially ruled as natural, would not have received as much attention from the authorities had it not been for the mysterious notes. Another theory is that McCormick wrote the notes himself. His family was shown the notes, and they do not know what it means. But they did point out that McCormick liked devising ciphers. The problem with this theory is that McCormick was a barely literate high school dropout. Could he have made a cipher that is so complex that it couldn't even be cracked by the FBI's Cryptanalysis Racketeering Records Unit and the American Cryptogram Association? A former codebreaker named Matthew Wade said that McCormick could have secretly been a genius when it came to math, and this is how he created the cipher. Wade also said that codebreaking is more about instincts and is not about how much education someone has. The third theory is that someone else wrote the notes and gave them to McCormick. It's possible that McCormick was involved in illegal activity like the drug trade or black market gambling, and the writing pertains to that. For example, the writing could represent debts people owe, or vehicle ID numbers, or details about drug shipments. McCormick may have needed to pass the coded message from the sender to the receiver by the key to deciphering the code. But this is all speculation, because no one has come close to cracking the code. Former codebreaker Matthew Wade thinks it's possible that it's a book cipher. A book cipher is created when the sender and the receiver have the same edition of the same book. For example, the first printing of the first edition of Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. The sender can use the letters in Infinite Jest to create a cipher. Then the receiver uses the same edition of Infinite Jest to decode the message. This type of cipher is exceedingly difficult to decode without knowing what book was used to create the cipher. According to Google, out of 2010, about 130 million books have been published in modern history. So guessing what book and what edition was used to create the code is practically impossible. The FBI is accepting suggestions on how to solve the cipher on their website. They said that there are 4 steps to deciphering a code. The first is to figure out what language was used to make the cipher. The second step is determining what system was used. Then you reconstruct the key, and then finally you reconstruct the plain text. The FBI uses the coded message seen on the screen now as an example. The first step is to determine the language. In this case, it's English. The next step is figuring out the system that was used to make the cipher. For this message, it's letter substitution. Then you construct the key, which is figuring out how the letters were changed. For this message, every letter is shifted one letter to the right in the alphabet. So N is actually M, F is actually E, and so on. Then you apply the key to the message. When you do that with the coded message on the screen, it reads, "Meet me at the park at noon." Since no one knows what Ricky McCormick's cipher means, it's impossible to know if the notes are clues in his murder. It may also be possible that the notes are just meaningless arrangements of numbers and letters. The FBI doubts this, but they have ruled out nothing. They believe that unless the notes are decoded, or someone comes forward with information, the murder of Ricky McCormick will remain unsolved. Number 1. The Eastdale Woman. On November 29, 1970, a man and his two young daughters were walking in East Alien, or the Ice Valley, just outside of Bergen, Norway. Some locals call the area Death Valley. It was a suicide hotspot in medieval times, and two hikers had accidentally fallen to their deaths there in the 1960s. The man and his two daughters noticed the smell of something burning. Then they came across the charred remains of what appeared to be a woman. They went into town and summoned the police. The woman's front was severely burned, but her back was not burned at all. It looked like she had fallen backwards after she caught fire. A matchbox and some sleeping pills were found beside her body. The autopsy revealed she had swallowed 50 to 60 sleeping pills shortly before she died. However, the pills had not taken effect by the time she died. It is believed that she was doused with gasoline and then she was set on fire. She had soot in her lungs, so it appears she was still alive when she was set on fire. The medical examiner cited the cause of death as a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and barbiturate overdose. The police initially thought she may have died from suicide. But the more they investigated the woman, they began to think that there was much more to the case. One odd thing was that they had a serious problem trying to identify her. No pieces of identification were on her, and her face was unrecognizable. She was about 5'4", she had blue eyes, and she had long brownish black hair that she was wearing in a ponytail that was tied with a blue and white print ribbon. She had a small round face with small ears. The police were expecting that within a few days someone would report her missing, but no one ever did. It appeared that the woman, or her killer, went to a lot of trouble to conceal her identity. Notably, all the labels of her clothes had been cut out. Without a name, the dead woman was called the Eastdale Woman. Beside her body, the police found some jewelry and a watch. A detective thought that the placement of the items looked ceremonial. Also found near the body was a broken umbrella and some drinking bottles. The labels of the bottles had been rubbed off. What was odd was that it didn't appear that any of the bottles had gasoline stored in them. If she set herself on fire, how did she transport the gas there and pour it on herself? The woman was barefoot when she died, and there was a pair of rubber boots next to the body. The police also thought that the area where the body was found was unusual. Bergen, Norway is not a tourist city, and she was found in an isolated area that was mostly known to locals. so it's suspected that she was meeting someone there or someone took her there. 3 days after the body was found, the police learned that 2 suitcases had been abandoned at the train station in Bergen. In the suitcases, there were several pairs of non-prescription eyeglasses. A fingerprint that was found on one of the lenses was matched to the dead woman. Also in the suitcases were some women's clothing. Like the clothes the woman was wearing, someone had cut the labels off of them. There were also several wigs, along with a comb and a hairbrush. In one of the suitcases, there were some cosmetics, and the labels had been rubbed off of them. A tube of eczema cream was also found in one of the suitcases. There had been a prescription label on the tube, but it had been peeled off. The suitcases also contained some German and Norwegian currency, and then there was some loose change that was a mixture of Belgian, British, and Swiss coins. Also found was a silver spoon that once had a monogram on it, but it had been filed off. There was also a plastic bag for a shoe store in Stavanger, Norway, which is about 130 miles from where the body was found. And finally, they found a piece of paper with what appeared to be a coded message. The police tried to use some of the objects in the suitcases to identify the woman. They showed the cosmetics to employees in several department stores in Norway, but no one recognized the products. The police even asked department store employees in other countries if they recognized the cosmetics, but no one knew where the cosmetics came from. The police had better luck with the plastic bag from the shoe store. They went to the store in Stavanger, and the store owner's son remembered a woman who matched the description of the Eastdale woman. He said that she was well dressed, that she spoke English, but she had an accent. He said that he remembered her because she took a long time picking out a pair of rubber boots. The store owner's son showed the police the type of boots the woman bought. They looked just like the boots found beside the body. The police also thought that the umbrella found near her body was also purchased at the store. So the police concluded that the Eastdale woman had been in the store. The police then went to businesses near the shoe store to see if a woman matching the description of the dead woman had recently been there. They learned she had recently stayed in a nearby hotel. When she checked in, she gave the name Fenella Lorch, but the police quickly determined that it was a fake name. From there, the police were able to find several hotels where she had stayed over the past 8 months. She used at least 6 different aliases when she checked into the hotels. Her travels appear to have started on March 20th, 1970, when she traveled from Geneva, Switzerland to Oslo, Norway. From March 21st to March 24th, she stayed in a hotel in Oslo under the name Genevieve Lancier. The next night, she stayed in Bergen, Norway, using the name Claudia Tielt. She checked into a different hotel in Bergen the next night, and she stayed there until April 1st. She then fell off the radar for about 6 months. Then, on October 3rd, 1970, she traveled from Stockholm, Sweden to Oslo, Norway, before settling in Oppdal, Norway, for an indeterminate amount of time. What is known is that from October 22nd to October 29th, she stayed in 2 hotels in Paris, France. Then on October 29th, she traveled from Paris to Stavanger, where she checked into a hotel using the name Claudia Nielsen. She stayed there for a night, and then she checked into a hotel in Bergen, Norway. She used the name Alexa Zarn Merchez, and she stayed in the hotel from October 30th to November 5th. She then moved on to Trondheim, Norway, where she used the name Vera Jarl to check into a hotel. She stayed in the hotel until November 8th, and then she traveled to Stavanger. That's when she checked into the hotel using the name Fenella Lorch. She stayed in the hotel for 9 days, and during this time, she bought the rubber boots. She checked out of the hotel on November 18th. She then traveled from Stavanger to Bergen, where she checked into a hotel on November 19th. This time, she used the alias Miss Leenhofer. She checked out the next day and then checked into another hotel in Bergen. She used the name Elizabeth Leenhofer. She stayed for 4 nights and then she checked out of the hotel on November 23, 1970. 6 days later, she was found dead in Isdalen, which is just outside of Bergen. The investigators thought that the fact that she used different aliases was interesting because most of the hotels required a passport to check in. They thought if she used different aliases, then she quite likely had fake passports for those aliases. Several people at the hotels remembered the woman. Besides speaking English, she also knew some German phrases. Most of the people who remembered her said that she dressed in fashionable clothes. At several of the hotels, she requested room changes. Many people believe that the Isdale woman was a spy. After all, she did die during the Cold War. Also, if she were a spy, it would explain why she traveled so much and used different aliases. Also, a spy could have several passports. And the wigs and the non-prescription eyeglasses found in her suitcases could have been her disguises. So the investigators set to work deciphering the coded message that was found in her suitcase. They were able to figure out what a segment of the code meant, but it did not help reveal her identity. The segment that was deciphered was a few lines in the middle of the page. 022-028P probably relates to her stay in Paris, France. Her first night in Paris was October 22nd, and her last night in the City of Lights was October 28th. Next to that is 029PS. On October 29th, she traveled from Paris to Stavanger. Below that, she wrote 029S. On October 29th, she stayed in Stavanger. Then under that, it says 030B and 5. That most likely pertains to the fact that she stayed in Bergen from October 30th to November 5th. The rest of the code message has never been deciphered. For decades, the Eastdale woman's identity, and if she was murdered or died by suicide, has remained mysteries. The case was reopened in 2016 so that new technology could be used to try and identify the body. One of the first things that were examined was the woman's teeth. 14 of the teeth had fillings, and she also had several gold crowns. Her teeth are unique for 2 reasons. The first is that she had a lot of dentistry work for someone her age. The second was that gold crowns were rare in Norway at the time. So she may have had dentistry work done in Central Europe, Southern Europe, East Asia, or South America. Another test that was performed on the remains is called oxygen isotope analysis. This test reveals where someone drank water while growing up. It can also help determine someone's age. The results of the test indicate that the woman was born sometime around 1930. This would have made her about 40 years old when she died. The results also indicated that she was born near Nuremberg, Germany. When she was young, she may have moved to an area that was close to the border of France and Germany. She may have been raised in French-speaking Belgium. Unfortunately, all the testing has not yet helped identify the woman. A DNA sample was taken from the woman, and if investigators use forensic genealogy, they may be able to determine, after 50 years, the identity of the Isdale woman. Until then, many questions will linger. Was her death a suicide? If so, why did she travel to an isolated area in Norway and kill herself in such a brutal fashion? Why did she want to keep her identity a mystery? Was she a spy? Why was she traveling so much before her death? If she was killed, why was she murdered? And who killed her? If she's identified, some of these questions may be answered, but we may never have the full story about what happened to the Isdale woman. Number 3. John Terrace. Brooks is a small city in Alberta, Canada. It is located about 116 miles from Calgary. In 2009, the population of the city was about 13,000 people. 26-year-old John Terrace lived in a small house on a quiet street in Brooks. On the evening of November 12, 2009, Terrace went to his parents' home to do laundry. They also lived in Brooks. But shortly after he started doing his laundry, he had to return home unexpectedly. It's believed that 26-year-old John Terrace encountered at least 2 men in his home. One of the men was armed with a handgun. Terrace had a set of samurai swords, and he managed to grab one of them. There was a struggle, and Terrace was slashed on the arm with the sword, and he was shot. It's also believed that Terrace managed to stab one of his attackers with the sword. After Terrace was shot, he managed to call 911, and first responders raced to his home. When they got there, they found that the attackers were gone, and Terrace was bleeding to death. He was airlifted to a hospital in Calgary. But sadly, 26-year-old John Terrace died a short time later. The police were able to talk to Terrace before he died, but he did not give them too much useful information. He did say that 2 men had attacked him. One was a white, tall man who was heavyset. He was the shooter. The other man was tall, thin, and of Asian descent. He was the one who was stabbed. It's believed that the man traveled nearly 200 miles to a hospital in Red Deer, Alberta, and got medical treatment for a stab wound. The police were unable to identify the man who was stabbed. The police looked around Terrace's home and noticed that only one thing was missing. It was the samurai sword that Terrace used to defend himself. The samurai sword possibly had dragon graphics on the handle and the blade. About 2 weeks after the murder, the police received an anonymous phone call. The caller talked about the murder, but they did not reveal the identities of the killers. The police believe that the call came from Calgary. Terrace had once lived in Calgary, and he would often drive 2 hours to the city. Then the police received this anonymous note in the mail. It was on a piece of paper with the letterhead of a business called Grandma's Attic Home Parties Incorporated. Grandma's Attic Home Parties was a home party planning business that was located in an industrial area of Calgary. The note says, with Terrace, it was self-defense, case closed. The writer misspelled Terrace's last name, leaving out one of the R's. The postmark indicated that the note was mailed from Calgary. The police and Terrace's family are hoping that someone will recognize the handwriting and contact the authorities. The police think that John Terrace's murder was premeditated. They also said that there may be information in the community that suggests that the murder may be connected to the drug trade. but they would neither confirm nor deny that Terrace's murder was drug-related. Terrace's family thinks that his killers were watching his home. When he left to go do laundry, they broke in and they were planning on stealing something. But then he surprised them when he returned home early. There was a struggle and Terrace stabbed one of his attackers. They got the sword away from him and then slashed him on the arm with it and then shot him. This theory goes along with the message on the note that the police received. When Terrace returned home, he may have acted aggressively to the men he found inside his home. The killers may have felt like they were defending themselves. The police think that John Terrace's murder is solvable. But unfortunately, after nearly 11 years, there have been no breaks in the case. The police and Terrace's family think that one of the best leads could come from identifying the author of the note. Or they hope that someone with information about the murder or the killers will come forward. John Terrace's family knows that solving the murder won't bring him back, but it might give them some closure. Number 2. Christine and Ronald Jabali Sr. New Baltimore, Michigan is a city in the Detroit metropolitan area. It was home to Christine and Ronald Jabali Sr. In 2006, the Jabalis, who were both 58, celebrated their 39th wedding anniversary. The couple had 2 sons, a daughter, and 9 grandchildren. Ronald Jabali Sr. was a self-made man. He never attended college. Instead, he worked as a truck driver. But he eventually became the top salesperson for a wholesale food business. Christine had been a homemaker, and she raised the couple's 3 children. In 1998, Ronald Sr. took out a mortgage on their home, and he invested the money in a butcher shop in Detroit's Eastern Market. The shop, called RJ Meat Shop, was managed by Ronald Sr.'s 2 sons, Ronald Jr. and Ryan. Ryan, the youngest of the Jabali children, worked at the front counter, and Ronald Jr., the eldest, was the manager. Ronald Sr. would work at the butcher shop on Saturdays when he was free. Christine and the Jabalis' only daughter, Nicole, would also work at the shop part-time. In the second week of October 2006, Ronald Sr. and Christine were supposed to go on vacation in Ireland. It was going to be their first vacation abroad. On the evening of October 6, 2006, Ronald Sr. and Christine were at home. Ronald Sr.'s best friend was over, and they were in the garage. Just before 8 p.m., Christine yelled out to Ronald Sr. that the pizza she made for dinner was ready. Ronald Sr.'s friend laughed and drove home. The next morning, Ronald Jr. and Ryan arrived at the butcher shop, and they were surprised to find that their father wasn't already there. They thought that this was unusual because their father was incredibly punctual. That morning, Ryan called his parents several times, but no one answered the phone. Ryan then called his girlfriend, who didn't live far from his parents' home, and he asked her to go check on them. She drove over to their home. In the garage, she found their dead bodies in congealed pools of blood. Their deaths had been brutal. They had been struck on the head 7 to 9 times with an unknown object. Both had been stabbed over a dozen times, and their throats were slit. The murder weapons have never been found. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Nothing of value appeared to have been stolen. Only 2 knives from the kitchen were missing. The police think that these were the murder weapons. Ronald Sr. still had his wallet on him. Christine was still wearing her jewelry, and her purse, which had cash in it, was still in the house. Besides the dead bodies in the garage, nothing appeared to be amiss in the home. The police determined that the couple was killed the night before their bodies were found. Leftover pizza was found on the stove. Ronald Sr. and Christine were very neat people, and they would have never left food out overnight. Also, blood was found on the driveway, and there was frost on the blood. Based on evidence found at the Jabalee home, the police suspected that they were killed by someone they knew. They theorized that Ronald Sr. was talking to the killer before the attack started in the garage. He tried to escape at the garage door, but the killer caught him and dragged him back into the garage. A partially eaten cookie and a pair of slippers were found on the steps leading from the garage to the house. The police believe that Christine casually walked into the garage and she saw her husband being attacked. She dropped the cookie and started to run, losing the slippers in the process. She was also struck in the head with the unknown weapon, which dazed her, or possibly she lost consciousness. While the couple was incapacitated, the killer got the two knives from the kitchen and then stabbed and slashed Ronald Sr. and Christine. The garage had been wiped down and mopped, so the police did not find much forensic evidence. The police thought that the most promising piece of evidence was found under the couple's Jeep that was parked in the garage. It appeared to be a message written in blood. It's believed that Christine wrote it because it was her blood. The police assumed it was a clue to the identity of the killer. The problem was that the police had no idea what the message meant. It appeared that when the killer mopped up the crime scene, he partially erased some of the letters in the message. The police thought that at least one letter was erased. According to the newspaper, the Macomb Daily, the letters that remained appeared to be S, C, E, E, J, and then the last letter is either G or a D. But there is no consensus on if those are the correct letters. Other people see different letters. Amateur sleuths have tried to determine what the message said. Some people thought that it said Nicole, which is the name of the Jabalee's daughter. Other people think it says JJ, which stands for Jabalee Jr. or Junior Jabalee, which would be Ronald Jr. A detective who worked on the case thought it said Son Jr., which again implicated Ronald Jr. Besides what they thought was written in blood, the police suspected that Ronald Jr. might have been the killer for several reasons. On the day the bodies were found, Ronald Jr. kept the butcher shop open all day and closed it at its regular time. At the end of the day, he told the workers that his parents had been murdered. One of those workers was his sister, Nicole. He called her into his office at the end of the workday and informed her then. After Ronald Jr. closed the shop for the day, he did not head home directly. Instead, he went to a house he was remodeling. The home was nearly done and it had running water and electricity. The police thought it was odd that Ronald Jr. would go to that house instead of going straight home. Ronald Jr. was married with 4 children, so shouldn't he have gone home and told them about the murders? Ronald Jr. was questioned about this, and he initially told the police he went to check on the house to make sure it had been broken into. But when he was interviewed months later, he had a different story. Ronald Jr. admitted that he was addicted to the painkiller Vicodin. Ronald Jr. said that he went to the home he was remodeling because he wanted to hide the Vicodin pills he had on him. He thought that if the police searched him and found the pills, they would be suspicious of him. The police thought that this story was very odd. If he wanted to get rid of the pills, why didn't he just throw them out the window while he was driving? Or why did he flush them down the toilet at the butcher shop? The police thought that Ronald Jr. killed his parents and then hid the murder weapons and his bloody clothes in the home that was being remodeled. He then went to the home the next day to permanently dispose of the evidence. Ronald Jr. also made unusual comments to two of his uncles. 8 days after the murders, Ronald Jr. said to his uncles that he might have killed his parents and just didn't remember. He said he might have done it while sleepwalking. While the police had their suspicions about Ronald Jr., they had no evidence that he was the killer. Notably, it was clear that Ronald Sr. and Christine put up a fight when they were murdered. But Ronald Jr. had no marks on him. The police also had never found the murder weapon, nor had they found any evidence that placed Ronald Jr. in his parents' home on the night of the murders. The police also have never found the murder weapons. Ronald Jr. had taken 3 polygraph exams. The first 2 times, the results were inconclusive. The last time, he failed. But this was not evidence that he had killed his parents. Over 2.5 years went by and no arrests were made. Then Ronald Sr.'s best friend, who was at their home on the night of the murders, reviewed a videotape of the crime scene. He noticed that something was missing from the garage. It was a 5-pound steel doorstop that looked like a fire poker. The friend knew the doorstop well because he was the one who had made it. He created a replica of the doorstop and he gave it to the police. The medical examiner determined that the doorstop was most likely the bludgeoning weapon. Even though the police had no physical evidence, 40-year-old Ronald Jabaley Jr. was arrested on June 26, 2010, nearly 3 years after the murders. Ronald Jabaley Jr. went to trial in October 2011. The district attorney painted a picture of what they thought happened on the night of the murders. According to their theory, Ronald Jr. stopped by his parents' home and he was talking to his father in the garage. His mother was on the couch in the living room reading a book and eating a cookie. Around 8:15 p.m., something happened and Ronald Jr. snapped. He grabbed the doorstop and he started beating his father with it. The noise attracted the attention of his mother, so she came out to the garage. When she saw her son beating his father, she dropped the cookies she was eating and ran at her son, losing her slippers in the process. He then beat her with the doorstop. While his parents were immobilized, Ronald Jr. grabbed the knives and then finished off his parents. He then went to the home he was remodeling, where he washed up and changed his clothes. Once he had cleaned himself up, he went home. Later that night, he snuck out of his family's home and he went to his parents' house. He wiped down and mopped the garage. The next day, after working all day, Ronald Jr. went back to the home he was remodeling and collected the murder weapons and the bloody clothes. He then disposed of all the evidence. 2 of Ronald Jr.'s uncles testified, and they said that 8 days after the murders, Ronald Jr. said that he might have killed his parents and just didn't remember the murders. One uncle also said that Ronald Jr. had threatened him because he was going to testify against him at the grand jury. His uncle was so nervous that he even got police protection. The defense argued that there was no physical evidence that showed that Ronald Jr. killed his parents. A recording of one of Ronald Jr.'s interviews with the police was played. Ronald Jr. explained that he made the statements to his uncles because he felt guilty that his parents had been killed and he couldn't have done anything to stop it. He had also denied committing the murders dozens of times. Another problem for the district attorney was that they didn't have a clear motive. Their main theory was that Ronald Jr. killed his parents over a financial dispute. They said that Ronald Jr. could have possibly been doing something with the butcher shop's finances. But there was no evidence that Ronald Jr. had done anything improper with the finances. Ronald Jr.'s wife testified. She said that she returned home on the night of the murders at around 8:30. She remembered the time specifically because her sister was visiting and she had left just before 8:30 and then her husband arrived home. According to the district attorney's timeline, the Jabalees were killed sometime between 8:15 and 8:20. Then Ronald Jr. went to the home he was remodeling, washed up, and then he went home. But if Ronald Jr. was home by 8:30, he would not have had time to do all that. Ronald Jr.'s wife also testified that he had no bruises, marks, or scratches on him, and he wasn't acting unusual. She said that he stayed home all evening and he went to bed around 10:30. He did not get up and leave the house until the next morning. Ronald Jabalee Jr.'s trial for first-degree murder lasted for 6 days. The jury deliberated for just an hour. They found Ronald Jr. not guilty on all counts. Despite the verdict, the district attorney's office and the New Baltimore Police Department believe that Ronald Jr. is the killer and they consider the case closed. Ronald Jr. and many people in his family, including his siblings, believe that he is innocent. They have tried to get the New Baltimore Police Department to reopen the case so that they can find the killer. In October 2012, on the 6th anniversary of the murders, Ronald Jr. offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. The Jabalee family said that they think the writing in the blood may be a clue. But regardless, they hope that someone with intimate knowledge of the murders will come forward and help solve the case. Number 1. Ghislaine Marshall. In 1991, Ghislaine Marshall was 65 years old. Marshall was the daughter of an industrialist. She got married for the first time when she was 16. The marriage produced a son, but she and her husband later got divorced. Marshall's sister ended up raising her son. Marshall's second husband was an industrialist who made his fortune from manufacturing headlights. The marriage did not produce a child. Marshall's husband died in 1982 and she inherited his wealth. In 1991, Marshall was splitting her time between Switzerland and Mougins, France. Mougins is a commune on the French Riviera and is just north of Cannes. Marshall lived in an upscale villa in the commune. On the morning of June 23, 1991, Marshall called her friend, Francine Pascal. They arranged to meet for lunch the next day. Then Marshall said she had to go because she was going over to a friend's home for lunch. Marshall never arrived at her friend's home for lunch. The next day, when Marshall didn't show up for her lunch meeting with her friend Francine Pascal, Pascal tried to call her several times. But her calls went unanswered. So Pascal went over to Marshall's home. She found nothing out of sorts, and there was no obvious signs that something was wrong. There was no evidence of a break-in or forced entry. When Pascal couldn't find Marshall, she called the gendarmerie, which are French soldiers that work as police officers. Gendarmes went to her villa and they searched for her. At around 5 p.m., they went into the basement. In the basement, there was a boiler room and the door was shut. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It took two of them to force the door open. It turned out that a folding bed and a metal bar were blocking the door. The metal bar was resting on a piece of lumber, and one end of the bar was jammed under the crack of the door. In the windowless boiler room, they found the dead body of 65-year-old Ghislaine Marchal. She had been stabbed 13 times. She had also been struck in the head 5 times with a piece of lumber that was under the piece of metal that was jammed under the door. It's believed that the weapon used to stab her was a 5-inch hunting knife. The knife has never been found. On the back of the door of the boiler room, written in blood, was Omar Mati. It appeared that Marchal, or possibly her killer, tried to write a message, but didn't finish it. The gendarmes searched the basement, and on the back of the basement door, written in blood, was the message, Omar Ma 2A. This roughly translates to, Omar kill me. Because of the messages, the gendarmes immediately had a suspect, Omar Radad. For the past 2 years, Radad had worked as Marchal's gardener. Omar Radad was arrested the next morning at his in-laws' home in Toulon. Radad was a Moroccan immigrant who was illiterate and he had a poor command of the French language. When Radad was interviewed by the gendarmes, he was not provided with a translator. So he responded yes to a lot of questions, even though he didn't understand them. Radad was asked if he visited prostitutes, and he said yes. Radad also said that yes, he liked to go to the casino. So the police thought that Radad got into an argument about money with Marchal, and then he killed her. He then stole some money from her purse. While Radad said yes to a lot of questions, he did not admit to killing Marchal. He also denied being at Marchal's home on the day she was killed. Omar Radad didn't have a strong alibi for the time of the murder. It's believed that Ghislaine Marchal was killed sometime between noon and 2 o'clock on Sunday, June 23rd. Usually, Radad didn't work on Sundays. But on June 24th, Radad, who was Muslim, planned on going to his in-laws' home in Toulon to celebrate Eid. To get the Monday off, he worked on Sunday, June 23rd, at the home of Francine Pascal. He worked there all morning, and then, at about noon, he stopped working to take a lunch break. Pascal lived a short distance away from Marchal, and Radad could have made it to Marchal's villa in a minute and a half on his moped. But Radad said he didn't go to Marchal's home. Instead, he drove his moped to a nearby bakery where he bought half a baguette. He then went home and he passed a neighbor as he walked to his apartment. Radad ate his lunch at home alone while he watched a quiz show on television. He left his home on his moped at about 12:40. At 12:45, he stopped at a phone booth and called his wife at her parents' home. Radad then returned to Pascal's home and worked the rest of the afternoon. Pascal said that Radad was wearing the same clothes that he was wearing that morning. The next morning, at 7 o'clock, Radad boarded a train to Toulon. But there were problems with Radad's alibi. Neither woman who was working at the bakery remembered Radad coming in that afternoon. But they did sell over 500 baguettes that day. Radad's neighbor was interviewed, and he also didn't remember seeing Radad that day. Omar Radad was subsequently charged with murder. There were a lot of problems with the case against him. After Radad was arrested, no marks were found on him. If he attacked Marshall, he probably would have had some scratches or bruises on him. The gendarmes collected the clothes that Radad was wearing on the day of the murder, and they did not find any blood or forensic evidence on them. Shortly after the body was found, Francine Pascal received a phone call from an anonymous caller. The caller said that Omar Radad would probably be arrested soon. What was unusual about the call was that the news of the murder had not been made public yet. This suggests that the caller knew intimate details about the crime scene because they were there. The call was never investigated. The most significant problems with the case were with the crime scene. Radad's fingerprints were not found in the basement. Also, the medical examiner said that based on the wounds, the killer was most likely left-handed. Radad was right-handed, and he had mobility problems with his right arm. He had undergone surgery on his right elbow because of an accident. So would he have been able to attack Marshall with two weapons? The gendarmes were also confused about how the door became blocked from the inside. The folding bed, which weighed 25 pounds, was jammed between the door and the wall. Then a metal bar was resting on a piece of lumber, and the bar was jammed under the crack of the door. The boiler room had no windows and only one door. How did the killer manage to block the door from the inside and then get out of the boiler room? One theory is that the bed and the bar were resting up against the wall on the opposite side of the door. When the killer left, the closing of the door caused the items to fall. Or the killer rested the items against the door and then they fell into place when the door closed. Another possibility is that Marshall barricaded herself in the room. But this presents a host of different problems that we'll discuss in a few minutes. What people find most troubling about the crime scene is that the only clues that implicated Radad were the two messages written in blood. If his name had not been written in the victim's blood, Radad probably wouldn't have been arrested because nothing else connected him to the crime scene. There are three possibilities as to who wrote the messages: Shazam Marshall, Omar Radad, or someone else wrote it to frame Radad. Let's explore the first theory, that Marshall wrote it as she lay dying. Would she have been able to write a message on the basement door and then get into the boiler room and write the second message? If she could move, why did she go into the boiler room instead of getting out of the basement? Even if she couldn't get up the stairs, couldn't she have gone to the base of the stairs and started yelling for help? Also, no fingerprints were found in the blood. Would Marshall have used her fingertips to write the messages? If she wrote them, she most likely would have left one fingerprint in the blood. The gendarmerie's theory is that Marshall was attacked and she wrote the message on the basement door. Then, for some reason, she made her way to the boiler room, started to write the second message, but she didn't finish it. She'd either become too weak to finish it, or she stopped writing for some other reason. One theory is that she heard the killer come back into the basement, so she stopped writing and barricaded herself in the room to shield herself from further attack. But this idea doesn't make a lot of sense. If Marshall was able to write the message, she was probably left alone in the basement. It's not likely that the killer would have attacked her and then watched her write the message. Why would Marshall take the time and energy to write a message that she had been killed instead of trying to get out of the basement so that she could get help? If she were conscious, she would have realized that she was in dire need of medical help. On a basic survival instinct level, wouldn't she have tried to get help instead of writing a message on the back of the door and then going into the boiler room, which had no other way out, and try and write the same message? One explanation is that because of her attack, she wasn't physically able to get out of the basement. But if she wasn't physically able to get out of the basement, would she have been physically able to write the message on the door, then get into another room, start to write the message on that door, and then use the bed and the bar to barricade herself in the room? As we mentioned before, one possibility is that the killer came back into the basement after the attack, and she got into the boiler room to get away from him. Marshall probably would have only barricaded herself in the boiler room if she knew the killer came back into the basement. When humans are badly wounded, their instinct isn't to hide. If Marshall thought she was already dying, enough to write that she had been killed in her own blood, wouldn't it have been better for her to risk being found in the main part of the basement instead of barricading herself in the boiler room? Besides shielding herself from further attack, there was no benefit to barricading herself in the boiler room. Barricading herself in the boiler room would have meant certain death because help would not have been able to get to her. Another problem with the idea that Marshall barricaded herself in the room was that she had been struck 5 times in the head with a piece of lumber and stabbed 13 times. Would she have been able to escape her killer and get into the boiler room without him catching her first? Also, it's assumed that she would have dragged herself or crawled into the boiler room. But there were no bloodstains that indicated that this happened. Instead, the blood drops seemed to indicate that the killer carried her into the boiler room. Another problem is the phrasing of the message on the back of the basement door. If Marshall wrote it, that she was clearly alive when she did it. Why would she write she had been killed when she was still alive? Why not just write Omar's name and leave it at that? Or why not write something like, Omar attacked me? Another problem is the words that she used. The scrawl said Omar Matue, which is grammatically incorrect. The correct way of writing it is on the screen now. Both sentences are pronounced the same way, but the way it was written on the back of the door is grammatically incorrect. The writer used the infinitive form of the verb kill instead of the past participle killed. In French, the spelling of a verb can change depending on if the subject of the sentence is male or female. In the sentence Omar Matue, the verb kill is tue. Since Ghislaine Marshall was female, tue should have been spelled T-U-E with an accent and then another E. If Marshall had been a male, the word tue would have been spelled this way, with only one E. Marshall was a highly educated French woman, and she often did crosswords. Many people do not think she would have made this mistake. One possible explanation is that Marshall had been beaten in the head and she was losing blood, so she probably wasn't thinking clearly. What else is interesting is that the mistake is only apparent when it's written out. When it's spoken, the infinitive, masculine, and feminine versions of the spelling of the verb kill are pronounced the same way, tue. So this would have been an easy mistake for someone to make whose first language isn't French. This brings us to the second option as to who wrote the message, Omar Radad. Radad's first language was not French. But the problem is that Radad was illiterate and he could only write and read his own name. Also, why would he write his own name to implicate himself? This leaves the third option, which is that someone else wrote the message to frame Omar Radad. They would have had a reason to hide their fingerprints, which would explain why there weren't any fingerprints found in the blood. If the killer's first language wasn't French, it would also explain the grammatical mistake. Finally, if it was written to frame Radad, it clearly worked because he was arrested and charged with the murder. After Radad was charged with murder, he was held in jail while he awaited his trial. He maintained that he was innocent. He even went on 2 hunger strikes to protest his arrest. One hunger strike lasted for 36 days. Omar Wadad's trial started on January 24th, 1994. It lasted for about a week. Besides his name being written in blood at the crime scene, no other physical evidence connected him to the crime. The defense was also able to discredit the theory regarding motive. It was thought that Wadad killed Marshall because they had gotten into an argument over money. He wanted in advance and she refused to give it to him. It was thought that some money was stolen from Marshall's purse, but this has never been proven. Also, nothing had been stolen from Marshall's home and she was still wearing her jewelry. If Wadad was so hard up for money, wouldn't he have stolen some items? Other people who employed Wadad said that he was never greedy. One man who employed Wadad said the biggest problem was getting him to take his entire pay. He also said that if Wadad needed money, he would have been happy to give him a loan because he respected Wadad and he thought he was a hard worker. The gendarmerie theorized that Wadad was deeply in debt because he gambled and frequented prostitutes. But the evidence showed that Wadad's financial situation was not dire enough to murder someone. The gendarmes interviewed many sex workers, and none of them had ever met Wadad. All the evidence, including the witness statements, indicated that Wadad was just a hard-working family man. Omar Wadad's trial lasted for about a week. The jury deliberated for 6.5 hours. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Many people were outraged by the verdict. In May 1996, at the request of the King of Morocco, French President Jacques Chirac granted Omar Wadad a partial pardon. He reduced Wadad's sentence to 4 years and 8 months, allowing him to be paroled at any time. Wadad was paroled 2 years later, in September 1998. Since Wadad's release, more investigation has been done into the murder. Several handwriting experts compared the handwriting of the bloody messages to Marshall's handwriting on crosswords she completed. The experts said that she most likely did not write the bloody messages. In 2001, DNA testing was done on the blood found at the crime scene. Blood from a male was found mixed with Marshall's blood. The male's blood was not Omar Wadad's. No match to the male DNA has ever been found. Despite all this, in the autumn of 2002, the Court of Review and Reconsideration confirmed that Omar Wadad killed Ghislaine Marshall, and they would not grant Wadad a new trial. Omar Wadad has always proclaimed his innocence. The murder of Ghislaine Marshall, or the Omar Wadad affair, is one of the most famous criminal cases in modern France. It has been the subject of several books, documentaries, and a movie. Many people believe that Omar Wadad is innocent and the real killer got away with murder.